Chapter 21 of the Voyage Out by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Thanks to Mr. Flushing's discipline, the right stages of the river were reached at the right hours, and when, next morning after breakfast, the chairs were again drawn out in a semicircle in the bow, the launch was within a few miles of the native camp, which was the limit of the journey. Mr. Flushing, as he sat down, advised them to keep their eyes fixed on the left bank, where they would soon pass a clearing, and in that clearing was a hut where Mr. Mackenzie, the famous explorer, had died of fever some 10 years ago, almost within reach of civilization. Mackenzie, he repeated, the man who went farther inland than anyone's been yet. Their eyes turned that way obediently. The eyes of Rachel saw nothing. Yellow and green shapes did, it is true, pass before them, but she only knew that one was large and another small. She did not know that they were trees. The directions to look here and there irritated her, as interruptions irritate a person absorbed in thought, although she was not thinking of anything. She was annoyed with all that was said, and with the aimless movements of people's bodies, because they seemed to interfere with her and to prevent her from speaking to Terence. Very soon Helen saw her staring moodily at a coil of rope, and making no effort to listen. Mr. Flushing and St. John were engaged in more or less continuous conversation about the future of the country from a political point of view, and the degree to which it had been explored. The others, with their legs stretched out, or chins poised on the hands, gazed in silence. Mrs. Ambrose looked and listened obediently enough, but inwardly she was prey to an uneasy mood not readily to be ascribed to any one cause. Looking on shore, as Mr. Flushing bade her, she thought the country very beautiful, but also sultry and alarming. She did not like to feel herself the victim of unclassified emotions, and certainly, as the launch slipped on and on in the hot morning sun, she felt herself unreasonably moved. Whether the unfamiliarity of the forest was the cause of it, or something less definite, she could not determine. Her mind left the scene, and occupied itself with anxieties for Ridley, for her children, for far-off things, such as old age, and poverty, and death. Hurst, too, was depressed. He had been looking forward to this expedition as to a holiday, for once away from the hotel, surely wonderful things would happen. Instead of which, nothing happened, and here they were as uncomfortable, as restrained, as self-conscious as ever. That, of course, was what came of looking forward to anything. One was always disappointed. He blamed Wilfrid Flushing, who was so well dressed and so formal. He blamed Hewitt and Rachel. Why didn't they talk? He looked at them sitting silent and self-absorbed, and the sight annoyed him. He supposed that they were engaged, or about to become engaged, but instead of being in the least romantic or exciting, that was as dull as everything else. It annoyed him, too, to think that they were in love. He drew close to Helen and began to tell her how uncomfortable his night had been, lying on the deck, sometimes too hot, sometimes too cold, and the stars so bright that he couldn't get to sleep. He had lain awake all night thinking, and when it was light enough to see, he had written 20 lines of his poem on God, and the awful thing was that he'd practically proved the fact that God did not exist. He did not see that he was teasing her, and he went on to wonder what would happen if God did exist. An old gentleman in a beard and a long blue dressing-gown, extremely testy and disagreeable as he's bound to be. Can you suggest a rhyme? God, rod, sod, all used. Any others? Although he spoke much as usual, Helen could have seen, had she looked, that he was also impatient and disturbed. But she was not called upon to answer, for Mr. Flushing now exclaimed, "There!" They looked at the hut on the bank, a desolate place with a large rent in the roof, and the ground round it yellow, scarred with fires and scattered with rusty open tins. "Did they find his dead body there?" Mrs. Flushing exclaimed, leaning forward in her eagerness to see the spot where the explorer had died. "They found his body and his skins and a notebook," her husband replied. But the boat had soon carried them on and left the place behind. It was so hot that they scarcely moved, except now to change a foot or again to strike a match. Their eyes, concentrated upon the bank, were full of the same green reflections, and their lips were slightly pressed together, as though the sights they were passing gave rise to thoughts, save that Hurst's lips moved intermittently, as half-consciously he sought rhymes for God. Whatever the thoughts of the others, no one said anything for a considerable space. They had grown so accustomed to the wall of trees on either side that they looked up with a start when the light suddenly widened out and the trees came to an end. "It almost reminds one of an English park," said Mr. Flushing. Indeed, no change could have been greater. On both banks of the river lay an open, lawn-like space, grass-covered and planted, for the gentleness and order of the place suggested human care, with graceful trees on the top of little mounds. As far as they could gaze, this lawn rose and sank with the undulating motion of an old English park. The change of scene naturally suggested a change of position. Grateful to most of them, they rose and leant over the rail. "It might be Arundel or Windsor," Mr. Flushing continued, "if you cut down that bush with the yellow flowers. And, by Jove, look!" Rows of brown backs paused for a moment and then leapt with emotion as if they were springing over waves out of sight. For a moment no one of them could believe that they had really seen live animals in the open. A herd of wild deer, and the sight aroused a childlike excitement in them, dissipating their gloom. "I've never in my life seen anything bigger than a hare!" Hurst exclaimed with genuine excitement. "What an ass I was not to bring my kodak!" Soon afterwards the launch came gradually to a standstill, and the captain explained to Mr. Flushing that it would be pleasant for the passengers if they now went for a stroll on shore. If they chose to return within an hour, he would take them on to the village. If they chose to walk, it was only a mile or two farther on, he would meet them at the landing-place. The matter being settled, they were once more put on shore. The sailors, producing raisins and tobacco, leant upon the rail and watched the 6 English, whose coats and dresses looked so strange upon the green, wander off. A joke that was by no means proper set them all laughing, and then they turned round and lay at their ease upon the deck. Directly they landed, Terence and Rachel drew together slightly in advance of the others. "Thank God!" Terence exclaimed, drawing a long breath. "At last we're alone." "And if we keep ahead we can talk," said Rachel. Nevertheless, although their position some yards in advance of the others made it possible for them to say anything they chose, they were both silent. "You love me?" Terence asked at length, breaking the silence painfully. To speak or to be silent was equally an effort, for when they were silent they were keenly conscious of each other's presence, and yet words were either too trivial or too large. She murmured inarticulately, ending, "And you?" "Yes, yes," he replied. But there were so many things to be said, and now that they were alone it seemed necessary to bring themselves still more near, and to surmount a barrier which had grown up since they had last spoken. It was difficult, frightening even, oddly embarrassing. At one moment he was clear-sighted, and at the next confused. "Now I'm going to begin at the beginning," he said resolutely. "I'm going to tell you what I ought to have told you before. In the first place, I've never been in love with other women, but I've had other women. Then I've great faults. I'm very lazy, I'm moody," he persisted in spite of her exclamation. "You've got to know the worst of me. I'm lustful, I'm overcome by a sense of futility, incompetence. I ought never to have asked you to marry me, I expect. I'm a bit of a snob, I'm ambitious." "Oh, our faults!" she cried. "What do they matter?" Then she demanded, "Am I in love? Is this being in love? Are we to marry each other?" Overcome by the charm of her voice and her presence, he exclaimed, Oh, you're free, Rachel. To you time will make no difference, or marriage, or—" The voices of the others behind them kept floating, now farther, now nearer, and Mrs. Flushing's laugh rose clearly by itself. "Marriage?" Rachel repeated. The shouts were renewed behind, warning them that they were bearing too far to the left. Improving their course, he continued, "Yes, marriage." The feeling that they could not be united until she knew all about him made him again endeavour to explain. "All that's been bad in me, the things I've put up with, the second best." She murmured, considered her own life, but could not describe how it looked to her now. "And the loneliness," he continued. A vision of walking with her through the streets of London came before his eyes. "We will go for walks together," he said. The simplicity of the idea relieved them, and for the first time they laughed. They would have liked had they dared to take each other by the hand, but the consciousness of eyes fixed on them from behind had not yet deserted them. "Books, people, sights, Mrs. Nutt, Greeley, Hutchinson," Hewitt murmured. With every word the mist which had enveloped them, making them seem unreal to each other since the previous afternoon, melted a little further, and their contact became more and more natural. Up through the sultry southern landscape they saw the world they knew appear clearer and more vividly than it had ever appeared before. As upon that occasion at the hotel when she had sat in the window, the world once more arranged itself beneath her gaze very vividly and in its true proportions. She glanced curiously at Terence from time to time, observing his grey coat and his purple tie, observing the man with whom she was to spend the rest of her life. After one of these glances she murmured, "Yes, I'm in love. There's no doubt. I'm in love with you." Nevertheless they remained uncomfortably apart, drawn so close together as she spoke that there seemed no division between them, and the next moment separate and far away again. Feeling this painfully, she exclaimed, "It will be a fight." But as she looked at him she perceived from the shape of his eyes, the lines about his mouth, and other peculiarities, that he pleased her, and she added, "Where I want to fight, you have compassion. You're finer than I am. You're much finer." He returned her glance and smiled, perceiving, much as she had done, the very small individual things about her which made her delightful to him. She was his for ever. This barrier being surmounted, innumerable delights lay before them both. "I'm not finer," he answered. "I'm only older, lazier. A man, not a woman." "A man," she repeated, and a curious sense of possession coming over her, it struck her that she might now touch him. She put out her hand and lightly touched his cheek. His fingers followed where hers had been, and the touch of his hand upon his face brought back the overpowering sense of unreality. This body of his was unreal. The whole world was unreal. "What happened?" he began. "Why did I ask you to marry me? How did it happen?" Did you ask me to marry you? She wondered. They faded far away from each other, and neither of them could remember what had been said. "We sat upon the ground," he recollected. "We sat upon the ground," she confirmed him. The recollection of sitting upon the ground, such as it was, seemed to unite them again, and they walked on in silence, their minds sometimes working with difficulty and sometimes ceasing to work, their eyes alone perceiving the things round them. Now he would attempt again to tell her his faults, and why he loved her, and she would describe what she had felt at this time or at that time, and together they would interpret her feeling. So beautiful was the sound of their voices that by degrees they scarcely listened to the words they framed. Long silences came between their words, which were no longer silences of struggle and confusion, but refreshing silences, in which trivial thoughts moved easily. They began to speak naturally of ordinary things, of the flowers and the trees, how they grew there so red, like garden flowers at home, and there bent and crooked like the arm of a twisted old man. Very gently and quietly, almost as if it were the blood singing in her veins or the water of the stream running over stones, Rachel became conscious of a new feeling within her. She wondered for a moment what it was, and then she said to herself, with a little surprise at recognising in her own person so famous a thing, "This is happiness, I suppose." And aloud to Terence she spoke, "This is happiness." On the heels of her words he answered, "This is happiness," upon which they guessed that the feeling had sprung in both of them the same time. They began therefore to describe how this felt and that felt, how like it was, and yet how different, for they were very different. Voices behind them never reached through the waters in which they were now sunk. The repetition of Hewitt's name in short, dissevered syllables was to them the crack of a dry branch or the laughter of a bird. The grasses and breezes sounding and murmuring all round them, they never noticed that the swishing of the grasses grew louder and louder, and did not cease with the lapse of the breeze. A hand dropped abrupt as iron on Rachel's shoulder. It might have been a bolt from heaven. She fell beneath it, and the grass whipped across her eyes, and filled her mouth and ears. Through the waving stems she saw a figure, large and shapeless against the sky. Helen was upon her, rolled this way and that, now seeing only forests of green, and now the high blue of heaven. She was speechless and almost without sense. At last she lay still, all the grasses shaken round her and before her by her panting. Over her loomed two great heads, the heads of a man and a woman, of Terence and Helen. Both were flushed, both laughing, and the lips were moving. They came together and kissed in the air above her. Broken fragments of speech came down to her on the ground. She thought she heard them speak of love and then of marriage. Raising herself and sitting up, she too realised Helen's soft body, the strong and hospitable arms, the happiness swelling and breaking in one vast wave. When this fell away, and the grasses once more lay low, and the sky became horizontal, and the earth rolled out flat on each side, and the trees stood upright, she was the first to perceive a little row of human figures standing patiently in the distance. For the moment she could not remember who they were. "Who are they?" she asked, and then recollected. Falling into line behind Mr. Flushing, they were careful to leave at least 3 yards distance between the toe of his boot and the rim of her skirt. He led them across a stretch of green by the river bank and then through a grove of trees, and bade them remark the signs of human habitation, the blackened grass, the charred tree stumps, and there, through the trees, strange wooden nests, drawn together in an arch where the trees drew apart. The village, which was the goal of their journey. Stepping cautiously, they observed the women, who were squatting on the ground in triangular shapes, moving their hands, either plaiting straw or in kneading something in bowls. But when they had looked for a moment undiscovered, they were seen, and Mr. Flushing, advancing into the centre of the clearing, was engaged in talk with a lean, majestic man, whose bones and hollows at once made the shapes of the Englishman's body appear ugly and unnatural. The women took no notice of the strangers, except that their hands paused for a moment and their long narrow eyes slid round and fixed upon them with the motionless, inexpensive gaze of those removed from each other far, far beyond the plunge of speech. Their hands moved again, but the stare continued. It followed them as they walked, as they peered into the huts where they could distinguish guns leaning in the corner, and bowls upon the floor, and stacks of rushes. In the dusk the solemn eyes of babies regarded them, and old women stared out too. As they sauntered about, the stare followed, passing over their legs, their bodies, their heads. Curiously, not without hostility, like the crawl of a winter fly. As she drew apart her shawl and uncovered her breast to the lips of her baby, the eyes of a woman never left their faces, although they moved uneasily under her stare, and finally turned away, rather than stand there looking at her any longer. When sweetmeats were offered them, they put out great red hands to take them, and felt themselves treading cumbrously, like tight-coated soldiers, among these soft instinctive people. But soon the life of the village took no notice of them. They became absorbed in it. The women's hands became busy again with the straw. Their eyes dropped. If they moved, it was to fetch something from the hut, or to catch a straying child, or to cross the space with a jar balanced on their heads. If they spoke, it was to cry some harsh, unintelligible cry. Voices rose when a child was beaten, and fell again. Voices rose in song, which slid up a little way and down a little way, and settled again upon the same low and melancholy note. Seeking each other, Terence and Rachel drew together under a tree. Peaceful and even beautiful at first, the sight of the women, who had given up looking at them, made them now feel very cold and melancholy. "Well," Terence sighed at length, "it makes us seem insignificant, doesn't it?" Rachel agreed. So it would go on for ever and ever, she said, those women sitting under the trees and the river. They turned away and began to walk through the trees, leaning, without fear of discovery, upon each other's arms. They had not gone far before they began to assure each other once more that they were in love, were happy, were content. But why was it so painful being in love? Why was there so much pain in happiness? The sight of the village indeed affected them all curiously, though all differently. St. John had left the others and was walking slowly down to the river, absorbed in his own thoughts, which were bitter and unhappy, for he felt himself alone. And Helen, standing by herself in the sunny space among the native women, was exposed to presentiments of disaster. The cries of the senseless beasts rang in her ears high and low in the air, as they ran from tree trunk to tree top. How small the little figures looked wandering through the trees! She became acutely conscious of the little limbs, the thin veins, the delicate flesh of men and women, which breaks so easily and lets the life escape, compared with these great trees and deep waters. A falling branch, a foot that slips, and the earth has crushed them or the water drowned them. Thus thinking, she kept her eyes anxiously fixed upon the lovers, as if by doing so she could protect them from their fate. Turning, she found the Flushings by her side. They were talking about the things they had bought, and arguing whether they were really old, and whether there were not signs here and there of European influence. Helen was appealed to. She was made to look at a brooch, and then at a pair of earrings. But all the time she blamed them for having come on this expedition, for having ventured too far and exposed themselves. Then she roused herself and tried to talk, but in a few moments she caught herself seeing a picture of a boat upset on the river in England at midday. It was morbid, she knew, to imagine such things. Nevertheless, she sought out the figures of the others between the trees, and whenever she saw them she kept her eyes fixed on them, so that she might be able to protect them from disaster. And when the sun went down and the steamer turned and began to steam back towards civilization, again her fears were calmed. In the semi-darkness the chairs on deck and the people sitting in them were angular shapes, the mouth being indicated by a tiny burning spot, and the arm by the same spot moving up and down as the cigar or cigarette was lifted to and from the lips. Words crossed the darkness, but not knowing where they fell, seemed to lack energy and substance. Deep sighs proceeded regularly, although with some attempt at suppression, from the large white mound which represented the person of Mrs. Flushing. The day had been long and very hot, and now that all the colours were blotted out, the cool night air seemed to press soft fingers upon the eyelids, sealing them down. Some philosophical remark directed apparently at St. John Hurst missed its aim, and hung so long suspended in the air until it was engulfed by a yawn, that it was considered dead, and this gave the signal for stirring of legs and murmurs about sleep. The white mound moved, finally lengthened itself and disappeared, and after a few turns and paces, St. John and Mr. Flushing withdrew, leaving the 3 chairs still unoccupied by 3 silent bodies. The light which came from a lamp high on the mast, and a sky pale with stars, left them with shapes but without features. But even in this darkness, the withdrawal of the others made them feel each other very near, for they were all thinking of the same thing. For some time no one spoke, then Helen said with a sigh, "So you're both very happy?" As if washed by the air, her voice sounded more spiritual and softer than usual. Voices at a little distance answered her, yes. Through the darkness she was looking at them both and trying to distinguish them. What was there for her to say? Rachel had passed beyond her guardianship. A voice might reach her ears, but never again would it carry as far as it had carried 24 hours ago. Nevertheless, speech seemed to be due from her before she went to bed. She wished to speak, but she felt strangely old and depressed. "Do you realise what you're doing?" she demanded. "She's young, you're both young, and marriage—" Here she ceased. They begged her, however, to continue, with such earnestness in their voices, as if they only craved advice, that she was led to add, "Marriage, well, that's not easy." "That's what we want to know," they answered, and she guessed that now they were looking at each other. "It depends on both of you," she stated. Her face was turned towards Terence, and although he could hardly see her, he believed that her words really covered a genuine desire to know more about him. He raised himself from his semi-recumbent position and proceeded to tell her what she wanted to know. He spoke as lightly as he could in order to take away her depression. "I'm 27, and I've about 700 a year," he began. "My temper is good on the whole, and health excellent, though Hurst detects a gouty tendency. Well then, I think I'm very intelligent." He paused as if for confirmation. Helen agreed. "Though, unfortunately, rather lazy. I intend to allow Rachel to be a fool if she wants to, and—do you find me on the whole satisfactory in other respects?" he asked shyly. "Yes, I like what I know of you," Helen replied. "But then one knows so little." "We shall live in London," he continued, "and—" With one voice they suddenly inquired whether she did not think them the happiest people that she had ever known. "Hush!" she checked them. "Mrs. Flushing, remember, she's behind us." Then they fell silent, and Terence and Rachel felt instinctively that their happiness had made her sad, and, while they were anxious to go on talking about themselves, they did not like to. "We've talked too much about ourselves," Terence said. "Tell us—" "Yes, tell us," Rachel echoed. They were both in the mood to believe that everyone was capable of saying something very profound. "What can I tell you?" Helen reflected, speaking more to herself in a rambling style than as a prophetess delivering a message. She forced herself to speak. "After all, though I scold Rachel, I'm not much wiser myself. I'm older, of course. I'm half-way through, and you're just beginning. It's puzzling sometimes, I think, disappointing. The great things aren't as great, perhaps, as one expects. But it's interesting. Oh, yes, you're certain to find it interesting. And so it goes on." They became conscious here of the procession of dark trees into which, as far as they could see, Helen was now looking. "And there are pleasures where one doesn't expect them. You must write to your father, and you'll be very happy, I've no doubt. But I must go to bed, and if you are sensible you will follow in 10 minutes, and so—" She rose and stood before them, almost featureless and very large. "Good night." She passed behind the curtain. After sitting in silence for the greater part of the 10 minutes she allowed them, they rose and hung over the rail. Beneath them, the smooth black water slipped away very fast and silently. The spark of a cigarette vanished behind them. "A beautiful voice," Terence murmured. Rachel assented. Helen had a beautiful voice. After a silence, she asked, looking up at the sky, "Are we on the deck of a steamer on a river in South America? Am I Rachel? Are you Terence?" The great black world lay round them. As they were drawn smoothly along, it seemed possessed of immense thickness and endurance. They could discern pointed tree-tops and blunt, rounded tree-tops. Raising their eyes above the trees, they fixed them on the stars and the pale border of sky above the trees. The little points of frosty light infinitely far away drew their eyes and held them fixed, so that it seemed as if they stayed a long time and fell a great distance when once more they realized their hands grasping the rail and their separate bodies standing side by side. "You'd forgotten completely about me," Terence reproached her, taking her arm and beginning to pace the deck. "And I never forget you." Oh, no, she whispered. She had not forgotten. Only the stars, the night, the dark. "You're like a bird half asleep in its nest, Rachel. You're asleep. You're talking in your sleep." Half asleep, and murmuring broken words, they stood in the angle made by the bow of the boat. It slipped on down the river. Now a bell struck on the bridge, and they heard the lapping of water as it rippled away on either side, and once a bird startled in its sleep, creaked, flew on to the next tree, and was silent again. The darkness poured down profusely, and left them with scarcely any feeling of life, except that they were standing there together in the darkness. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Voyage Out by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. The darkness fell, but rose again, and as each day spread widely over the earth, and parted them from the strange day in the forest when they had been forced to tell each other what they wanted, this wish of theirs was revealed to other people, and in the process became slightly strange to themselves. Apparently, it was not anything unusual that had happened. It was that they had become engaged to marry each other. The world, which consisted for the most part of the hotel and the villa, expressed itself glad on the whole that two people should marry, and allowed them to see that they were not expected to take part in the work which has to be done in order that the world shall go on, but might absent themselves for a time. They were accordingly left alone until they felt the silence, as if, playing in a vast church, the door had been shut on them. They were driven to walk alone, and sit alone, to visit secret places where the flowers had never been picked, and the trees were solitary. In solitude they could express those beautiful but too vast desires which were so oddly uncomfortable to the ears of other men and women. Desires for a world, such as their own world, which contained two people, seemed to them to be where people knew each other intimately, and thus judged each other by what was good, and never quarrelled, because that was a waste of time. They would talk of such questions among books, or out in the sun, or sitting in the shade of a tree undisturbed. They were no longer embarrassed, or half choked with meaning which could not express itself. They were not afraid of each other, or, like travellers down a twisting river, dazzled with sudden beauties when the corner is turned. The unexpected happened, but even the ordinary was lovable, and in many ways preferable to the ecstatic and mysterious, for it was refreshingly solid, and called out effort, and effort under such circumstances was not effort but delight. While Rachel played the piano, Terence sat near her, engaged, as far as the occasional writing of a word in pencil testified, in shaping the world as it appeared to him now that he and Rachel were going to be married. It was different, certainly. The book called Silence would not now be the same book that it would have been. He would then put down his pencil and stare in front of him, and wonder in what respects the world was different. It had perhaps more solidity, more coherence, more importance, greater depth. Why, even the earth sometimes seemed to him very deep, not carved into hills and cities and fields, but heaped in great masses. He would look out of the window for 10 minutes at a time. But no, he did not care for the earth swept of human beings. He liked human beings. He liked them, he suspected, better than Rachel did. There she was, swaying enthusiastically over her music, quite forgetful of him. But he liked that quality in her. He liked the impersonality which it produced in her. At last, having written down a series of little sentences, with notes of interrogation attached to them, he observed aloud, "Under the heading Women, I've written, not really vainer than men, lack of self-confidence at the base of most serious faults, dislike of own sex traditional, or founded on fact? Every woman not so much a rake at heart as an optimist, because they don't think. What do you say, Rachel?" He paused with his pencil in his hand and a sheet of paper on his knee. Rachel said nothing. Up and up the steep spiral of a very late Beethoven sonata she climbed, like a person ascending a ruined staircase, energetically at first, then more laboriously advancing her feet with effort until she could go no higher, and returned with a run to begin at the very bottom again. Again, it's the fashion now to say that women are more practical and less idealistic than men, also that they have considerable organising ability but no sense of honour. Query: what is meant by masculine term, honour? What corresponds to it in your sex, eh? Attacking her staircase once more, Rachel again neglected this opportunity of revealing the secrets of her sex. She had, indeed, advanced so far in the pursuit of wisdom that she allowed these secrets to rest undisturbed. It seemed to be reserved for a later generation to discuss them philosophically. Crashing down a final chord with her left hand, she exclaimed at last, swinging round upon him: "No, Terence, it's no good. Here I am, the best musician in South America, not to speak of Europe and Asia, and I can't play a note because of you in the room interrupting me every other second." "You don't seem to realise that that's what I've been aiming at for the last half hour," he remarked. "I've no objection to nice simple tunes. Indeed, I find them very helpful to my literary composition. But that kind of thing is merely like an unfortunate old dog going round on its hind legs in the rain." He began turning over the little sheets of note-paper which were scattered on the table, conveying the congratulations of their friends. "All possible wishes for all possible happiness," he read. "Correct, but not very vivid, are they?" "They're sheer nonsense!" Rachel exclaimed. "Think of words compared with sounds," she continued. "Think of novels and plays and histories." Perched on the edge of the table, she stirred the red and yellow volumes contemptuously. She seemed to herself to be in a position where she could despise all human learning. Terence looked at them too. "God, Rachel, you do read trash!" he exclaimed. "And you're behind the times too, my dear. No one dreams of reading this kind of thing now. Antiquated problem plays, harrowing descriptions of life in the East End. Oh no, we've exploded all that. Read poetry, Rachel, poetry, poetry, poetry!" Picking up one of the books, he began to read aloud, his intention being to satirize the short, sharp bark of the writer's English, but she paid no attention, and after an interval of meditation, exclaimed: "Does it ever seem to you, Terence, that the world is composed entirely of vast blocks of matter, and that we're nothing but patches of light?" She looked at the soft spots of sun wavering over the carpet and up the wall. "Like that?" "No," said Terence. "I feel solid, immensely solid. The legs of my chair might be rooted in the bowels of the earth, but at Cambridge, I can remember, there were times when one fell into ridiculous states of semi-coma about 5 o'clock in the morning. Hurst does now, I expect. Oh no, Hurst wouldn't." Rachel continued: "The day your note came, asking us to go to the picnic, I was sitting where you're sitting now, thinking that. I wonder if I could think that again. I wonder if the world's changed, and if so, when it'll stop changing. And which is the real world?" "When I first saw you," he began, "I thought you were like a creature who'd lived all its life among pearls and old bones. Your hands were wet, do you remember? And you never said a word until I gave you a bit of bread, and then you said, 'Human beings.'" "And I thought you a prig," she recollected. "No, that's not quite it. There were the ants who stole the tongue, and I thought you and St. John were like those ants, very big, very ugly, very energetic, with all your virtues on your backs. However, when I talked to you, I liked you." "You fell in love with me," he corrected her. "You were in love with me all the time, only you did not know it." "No, I never fell in love with you," she asserted. "Rachel, what a lie! Didn't you sit here looking at my window? Didn't you wander about the hotel like an owl in the sun?" "No," she repeated, "I never fell in love, if falling in love is what people say it is, and it's the world that tells the lies and I tell the truth. Oh, what lies, what lies!" She crumpled together a handful of letters from Evelyn M., from Mr. Pepper, from Mrs. Thornbury and Miss Allen, and Susan Warrington. It was strange, considering how very different these people were, that they used almost the same sentences when they wrote to congratulate her upon her engagement. That any one of these people had ever felt what she felt, or could ever feel it, or had even the right to pretend for a single second that they were capable of feeling it, appalled her much as the church service had done, much as the face of the hospital nurse had done. And if they didn't feel a thing, why did they go and pretend to? The simplicity and arrogance and hardness of her youth, now concentrated into a single spark, as it was by her love of him, puzzled Terence. Being engaged had not that effect on him. The world was different, but not in that way. He still wanted the things he had always wanted, and in particular he wanted the companionship of other people more than ever perhaps. He took the letters out of her hand and protested. "Of course they're absurd, Rachel. Of course they say things just because other people say them. But even so, what a nice woman Miss Allen is. You can't deny that. And Mrs. Thornbury too. She's got too many children, I grant you, but if half a dozen of them had gone to the bad instead of rising infallibly to the tops of their trees. Hasn't she a kind of beauty, of elemental simplicity, as Flushing would say? Isn't she rather like a large old tree murmuring in the moonlight, or a river going on and on and on? By the way, Ralph's been made governor of the Caraway Islands, the youngest governor in the service. Very good, isn't it?" But Rachel was at present unable to conceive that the vast majority of the affairs of the world went on unconnected by a single thread with her own destiny. "I won't have 11 children," she asserted. "I won't have the eyes of an old woman. She looks at one up and down, as if one were a horse." "We must have a son, and we must have a daughter," said Terence, putting down the letters. "Because let alone the inestimable advantage of being our children, they'd be so well brought up." They went on to sketch an outline of the ideal education, how their daughter should be required from infancy to gaze at a large square of cardboard painted blue, to suggest thoughts of infinity, for women were grown too practical, and their son, he should be taught to laugh at great men, that is, at distinguished and successful men, at men who wore ribbons and rose to the tops of their trees. He should in no way resemble, Rachel added, St. John Hurst. At this Terence professed the greatest admiration for St. John Hurst. Dwelling upon his good qualities, he became seriously convinced of them. He had a mind like a torpedo, he declared, aimed at falsehood. Where should we all be without him and his like? Choked in weeds? Christian bigots? Why, Rachel herself would be a slave with a fan to sing songs to men when they felt drowsy. "But you'll never see it," he exclaimed, "because with all your virtues you don't, and you never will, care with every fibre of your being for the pursuit of truth. You've no respect for facts, Rachel. You're essentially feminine." She did not trouble to deny it, nor did she think good to produce the one unanswerable argument against the merits which Terence admired. St. John Hurst said that she was in love with him. She would never forgive that, but the argument was not one to appeal to a man. "But I like him," she said, and she thought to herself that she also pitied him, as one pities those unfortunate people who are outside the warm mysterious globe, full of changes and miracles, in which we ourselves move about. She thought that it must be very dull to be St. John Hurst. She summed up what she felt about him by saying that she would not kiss him, supposing he wished it, which was not likely. As if some apology were due to Hurst for the kiss which she then bestowed upon him, Terence protested. "And compared with Hurst, I'm a perfect zany." The clock here struck 12 instead of 11. "We're wasting the morning. I ought to be writing my book, and you ought to be answering these." "We've only got 21 whole mornings left," said Rachel, "and my father'll be here in a day or two." However, she drew a pen and paper towards her and began to write laboriously. "My dear Evelyn." Terence, meanwhile, read a novel which someone else had written, a process which he found essential to the composition of his own. For a considerable time nothing was to be heard but the ticking of the clock and the fitful scratch of Rachel's pen, as she produced phrases which bore a considerable likeness to those which she had condemned. She was struck by it herself, for she stopped writing and looked up, looked at Terence deep in the armchair, looked at the different pieces of furniture, at her bed in the corner, at the window pane which showed the branches of a tree filled in with sky, heard the clock ticking, and was amazed at the gulf which lay between all that and her sheet of paper. Would there ever be a time when the world was one and indivisible? Even with Terence himself, how far apart they could be, how little she knew what was passing in his brain now. She then finished her sentence, which was awkward and ugly, and stated that they were both very happy, and going to be married in the autumn probably, and hope to live in London, where we hope you will come and see us when we get back, choosing affectionately, after some further speculation, rather than sincerely. She signed the letter and was doggedly beginning on another, when Terence remarked, quoting from his book: "Listen to this, Rachel. It is probable that Hugh" (he's the hero, a literary man) "had not realised at the time of his marriage, any more than the young man of parts and imagination usually does realise, the nature of the gulf which separates the needs and desires of the male from the needs and desires of the female. At first they had been very happy. The walking tour of Switzerland had been a time of jolly companionship and stimulating revelations for both of them. Betty had proved herself an ideal comrade. They had shouted 'Love in the Valley' to each other across the snowy slopes of the Riffelhorn, and so on and so on. I'll skip the descriptions. But in London, after the boy's birth, all was changed. Betty was an admirable mother, but it did not take her long to find out that motherhood, as that function is understood by the mother of the upper middle classes, did not absorb the whole of her energies. She was young and strong, with healthy limbs and a body and brain that called urgently for exercise. In short, she began to give tea parties. Coming in late from this singular talk with old Bob Murphy in his smoky, book-lined room, where the two men had each unloosed his soul to the other, with the sound of the traffic humming in his ears and the foggy London sky slung tragically across his mind, he found women's hats dotted about among his papers, women's wraps and absurd little feminine shoes and umbrellas were in the hall. Then the bills began to come in. He tried to speak frankly to her. He found her lying on the great polar bear skin in the bedroom, half undressed, for they were dining with the Greens at Wilton Crescent, the ruddy firelight making the diamonds wink and twinkle on her bare arms and in the delicious curve of her breast, a vision of adorable femininity. He forgave her all. Well, this goes from bad to worse, and finally, about 50 pages later, Hugh takes a week-end ticket to Swanage, and has it out with himself on the downs above Corfe. And there's 15 pages or so which we'll skip. The conclusion is: they were different. Perhaps in the far future, when generations of men had struggled and failed, as he must now struggle and fail, woman would be, indeed, what she now made a pretence of being, the friend and companion, not the enemy and parasite of man. The end of it is, you see, Hugh went back to his wife, poor fellow. It was his duty as a married man. Lord, Rachel, he concluded, will it be like that when we're married?" Instead of answering him, she asked, "Why don't people write about things they do feel?" "Ah, that's the difficulty," he sighed, tossing the book away. "Well, then, what will it be like when we're married? What are the things people do feel?" She seemed doubtful. "Sit on the floor and let me look at you," he commanded. Resting her chin on his knee, she looked straight at him. He examined her curiously. "You're not beautiful," he began, "but I like your face. I like the way your hair grows down in a point, and your eyes too. They never see anything. Your mouth's too big, and your cheeks would be better if they had more colour in them. But what I like about your face is that it makes one wonder what the devil you're thinking about. It makes me want to do that." He clenched his fist and shook it so near her that she started back. "Because now you look as if you'd blow my brains out. There are moments," he continued, "when, if we stood on a rock together, you'd throw me into the sea." Hypnotized by the force of his eyes in hers, she repeated, "If we stood on a rock together." To be flung into the sea, to be washed hither and thither and driven about the roots of the world, the idea was incoherently delightful. She sprang up and began moving about the room, bending and thrusting aside the chairs and tables, as if she were indeed striking through the waters. He watched her with pleasure. She seemed to be cleaving a passage for herself, and dealing triumphantly with the obstacles which would hinder their passage through life. "It does seem possible!" he exclaimed, "though I've always thought it the most unlikely thing in the world. I shall be in love with you all my life, and our marriage will be the most exciting thing that's ever been done. We'll never have a moment's peace." He caught her in his arms as she passed him, and they fought for mastery, imagining a rock and the sea heaving beneath them. At last she was thrown to the floor, where she lay gasping and crying for mercy. "I'm a mermaid. I can swim," she cried, "so the game's up." Her dress was torn across, and, peace being established, she fetched a needle and thread and began to mend the tear. "And now," she said, "be quiet and tell me all about the world. Tell me about everything that's ever happened, and I'll tell you— Let me see, what can I tell you? I'll tell you about Miss Montgomery and the river party. She was left, you see, with one foot in the boat and the other on shore. They had spent much time already in thus filling out for the other the course of their past lives, and the characters of their friends and relations, so that very soon Terence knew not only what Rachel's aunts might be expected to say on every occasion, but also how their bedrooms were furnished, and what kind of bonnets they wore. He could sustain a conversation between Mrs. Hunt and Rachel, and carry on a tea party including the Reverend William Johnson and Miss Macquoid, the Christian Scientists, with remarkable likeness to the truth. But he had known many more people, and was far more likely skilled in the art of narrative than Rachel was, whose experiences were, for the most part, of a curiously childlike and humorous kind, so that it generally fell to her lot to listen and ask questions. He told her not only what had happened, but what he had thought and felt, and sketched for her portraits which fascinated her of what other men and women might be supposed to be thinking and feeling, so that she became very anxious to get back to England, which was full of people, where she could merely stand in the streets and look at them. According to him, too, there was an order, a pattern, which made life reasonable, or if that word was foolish, made it of deep interest anyhow, for sometimes it seemed possible to understand why things happened as they did. Nor were people so solitary and uncommunicative as she believed. She should look for vanity was a common quality, first in herself and then in Helen, in Ridley, in St. John. They all had their share of it, and she would find it in 10 people out of every 12 she met. And once linked together by one such tie, she would find them not separate and formidable, but practically indistinguishable, and she would come to love them when she found that they were like herself. If she denied this, she must defend her belief that human beings were as various as the beasts at the Zoo, which had stripes and manes and horns and humps. And so, wrestling over the entire list of their acquaintances, and diverging into anecdotes and theory and speculation, they came to know each other. That the hours passed quickly, and seemed to them full to leaking point. After a night's solitude, they were always ready to begin again. The virtues which Mrs. Ambrose had once believed to exist in free talk between men and women did in truth exist for both of them, although not quite in the measure she prescribed. Far more than upon the nature of sex they dwelt upon the nature of poetry, But it was true that talk which had no boundaries deepened and enlarged the strangely small bright view of a girl. In return for what he could tell her, she brought him such curiosity and sensitiveness of perception that he was led to doubt whether any gift bestowed by much reading and living was quite the equal of that for pleasure and pain. What would experience give her, after all, except a kind of ridiculous formal balance, like that of a drilled dog in the street? He looked at her face and wondered how it would look in 20 years' time, when the eyes had dulled, and the forehead wore those little persistent wrinkles which seemed to show that the middle-aged are facing something hard which the young do not see. What would the hard thing be for them, he wondered. Then his thoughts turned to their life in England. The thought of England was delightful, for together they would see the old things freshly. It would be England in June, and there would be June nights in the country, and the nightingales singing in the lanes into which they could steal when the room grew hot, and there would be English meadows gleaming with water and set with stolid cows, and clouds dipping low and trailing across the green hills. As he sat in the room with her, he wished very often to be back again in the thick of life, doing things with Rachel. He crossed to the window and exclaimed, "Lord, how good it is to think of lanes, muddy lanes, with brambles and nettles, you know, and real grass fields, and farmyards with pigs and cows, and men walking beside carts with pitchforks. There's nothing to compare with that here. Look at the stony red earth, and the bright blue sea, and the glaring white houses. How tired one gets of it! And the air, without a stain or a wrinkle. I'd give anything for a sea mist." Rachel, too, had been thinking of the English country, the flat land rolling away to the sea, and the woods, and the long straight roads where one can walk for miles without seeing anyone, and the great church towers, and the curious houses clustered in the valleys, and the birds, and the dusk, and the rain falling against the windows. "But London's the place," Terence continued. They looked together at the carpet, as though London itself were to be seen there lying on the floor, with all its spires and pinnacles pricking through the smoke. "On the whole, what I should like best at this moment," Terence pondered, "would be to find myself walking down Kingsway, by those big placards, you know, and turning into the Strand. Perhaps I might go and look over Waterloo Bridge for a moment. Then I'd go along the Strand past the shops with all the new books in them, and through the little archway into the Temple. I always like the quiet after the uproar. You hear your own footsteps suddenly quite loud. The Temple's very pleasant. I think I should go and see if I could find dear old Hodgkin, the man who writes books about Van Eyck, you know. When I left England he was very sad about his tame magpie. He suspected that a man had poisoned it. And then Russell lives on the next staircase. I think you'd like him. He's a passion for Handel. Well, Rachel," he concluded, dismissing the vision of London, "we shall be doing that together in 6 weeks' time, and it'll be the middle of June then. And June in London! My God, how pleasant it all is!" "And we're certain to have it too," she said. "It isn't as if we're expecting a great deal, only to walk about and look at things." "Only 1,000 a year, and perfect freedom," he replied. "How many people in London do you think have that?" "And now you've spoilt it," she complained. "Now we've got to think of the horrors." She looked grudgingly at the novel, which had once caused her perhaps an hour's discomfort, so that she had never opened it again, but kept it on her table and looked at it occasionally, as some mediaeval monk kept a skull or a crucifix to remind him of the frailty of the body. "Is it true, Terence," she demanded, "that women die with bugs crawling across their faces?" "I think it's very probable," he said. "But you must admit, Rachel, that we so seldom think of anything but ourselves that an occasional twinge is really rather pleasant." Accusing him of an affection of cynicism, which was just as bad as sentimentality itself, she left her position by his side and knelt upon the window-sill, twisting the curtain tassels between her fingers. A vague sense of dissatisfaction filled her. "What's so detestable in this country?" she exclaimed. is the blue, always blue sky and blue sea. It's like a curtain. All the things one wants are on the other side of that. I want to know what's going on behind it. I hate these divisions, don't you, Terence? One person in all the dark about another person. Now I like the Dalloways," she continued, "and they're gone. I shall never see them again. Just by going on a ship we cut ourselves off entirely from the rest of the world. I want to see England there, London there, all sorts of people. Why shouldn't one? Why should one be shut up all by oneself in a room?" While she spoke thus half to herself and with increasing vagueness, because her eye was caught by a ship that had just come into the bay, she did not see that Terence had ceased to stare contentedly in front of him, and was looking at her keenly and with dissatisfaction. She seemed to be able to cut herself adrift from him, and to pass away to unknown places where she had no need of him. The thought roused his jealousy. "I sometimes think you're not in love with me, and never will be," he said energetically. She started and turned round at his words. "I don't satisfy you in the way you satisfy me," he continued. "There's something I can't get hold of in you. You don't want me as I want you. You're always wanting something else." He began pacing up and down the room. "Perhaps I ask too much," he went on. "Perhaps it isn't really possible to have what I want. Men and women are too different. You can't understand. You don't understand." He came up to where she stood, looking at him in silence. It seemed to her now that what he was saying was perfectly true, and that she wanted many more things than the love of one human being, the sea, the sky. She turned again and looked at the distant blue, which was so smooth and serene where the sky met the sea. She could not possibly want only one human being. "Or is it only this damnable engagement?" he continued. "Let's be married here, before we go back. Or is it too great a risk? Are you sure we want to marry each other?" They began pacing up and down the room, but although they came very near each other in their pacing, they took care not to touch each other. The hopelessness of their position overcame them both. They were impotent. They could never love each other sufficiently to overcome all these barriers, and they could never be satisfied with less. Realizing this with intolerable keenness, she stopped in front of him and exclaimed, "Let's break it off, then." The words did more to unite them than any amount of argument. As if they stood on the edge of a precipice, they clung together. They knew that they could not separate. Painful and terrible it might be, but they were joined for ever. They lapsed into silence, and after a time crept together in silence. Merely to be so close soothed them, and sitting side by side the divisions disappeared, and it seemed as if the world were once more solid and entire, and as if, in some strange way, they had grown larger and stronger. It was long before they moved, and when they moved it was with great reluctance. They stood together in front of the looking-glass, and with a brush tried to make themselves look as if they had been feeling nothing all the morning, neither pain nor happiness. But it chilled them to see themselves in the glass, for instead of being vast and indivisible, they were really very small and separate, the size of the glass leaving a large space for the reflection of other things. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Voyage Out by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. But no brush was able to efface completely the expression of happiness, so that Mrs. Ambrose could not treat them, when they came downstairs, as if they had spent the morning in a way that could be discussed naturally. This being so, she joined in the world's conspiracy to consider them for the time incapacitated from the business of life, struck by their intensity of feeling into enmity against life, and almost succeeded in dismissing them from her thoughts. She reflected that she had done all that it was necessary to do in practical matters. She had written a great many letters, and had obtained Willoughby's consent. She had dwelt so often upon Mr. Hewitt's prospects, his profession, his birth, appearance, and temperament, that she had almost forgotten what he was really like. When she refreshed herself by a look at him, she used to wonder again what he was like, and then, concluding that they were happy at any rate, thought no more about it. She might more profitably consider what would happen in 3 years' time, or what might have happened if Rachel had been left to explore the world under her father's guidance. The result, she was honest enough to own, might have been better. Who knows? She did not disguise from herself that Terence had faults. She was inclined to think him too easy and tolerant, just as he was inclined to think her, perhaps, a trifle hard. No, it was rather that she was uncompromising. In some ways she found St. John preferable, but then, of course, he would never have suited Rachel. Her friendship with St. John was established, for although she fluctuated between irritation and interest in a way that did credit to the candour of her disposition, she liked his company on the whole. He took her outside this little world of love and emotion. He had a grasp of facts. Supposing, for instance, that England made a sudden move towards some unknown port on the coast of Morocco, St. John knew what was at the back of it, and to hear him engaged with her husband in argument about finance and the balance of power gave her an odd sense of stability. She respected their arguments without always listening to them, much as she respected a solid brick wall, or one of those immense municipal buildings which, although they compose the greater part of our cities, have been built day after day and year after year by unknown hands. She liked to sit and listen, and even felt a little elated when the engaged couple, after showing their profound lack of interest, slipped from the room, and were seen pulling flowers to pieces in the garden. It was not that she was jealous of them, but she did undoubtedly envy them their great unknown future that lay before them. Slipping from one such thought to another, she was at the dining-room with fruit in her hands. Sometimes she stopped to straighten a candle, stooping with the heat, or disturbed some too rigid arrangement of the chairs. She had reason to suspect that Chailey had been balancing herself on top of a ladder with a wet duster during their absence, and the room had never been quite like itself since. Returning from the dining-room for the third time, she perceived that one of the armchairs was now occupied by St. John. He lay back in it with his eyes half shut, looking, as he always did, curiously buttoned up in a neat grey suit, and fenced against the exuberance of a foreign climate which might at any moment proceed to take liberties with him. Her eyes rested on him gently, and then passed on over his head. Finally she took the chair opposite. "I didn't want to come here," he said at last, "but I was positively driven to it. Evelyn M.," he groaned. He sat up and began to explain with mock solemnity how the detestable woman was set upon marrying him. "She pursues me about the place. This morning she appeared in the smoking-room. All I could do was to seize my hat and fly. I didn't want to come, but I couldn't stay and face another meal with her." "Well, we must make the best of it," Helen replied philosophically. It was very hot, and they were indifferent to any amount of silence, so that they lay back in their chairs, waiting for something to happen. The bell rang for luncheon, but there was no sound of movement in the house. Was there any news, Helen asked? Anything in the papers? St. John shook his head. Oh yes, he had a letter from home, a letter from his mother, describing the suicide of the parlour-maid. She was called Susan Jane, and she came into the kitchen one afternoon and said that she wanted cook to keep her money for her. She had £20 in gold. Then she went out to buy herself a hat. She came in at 5:30 and said that she had taken poison. They had only just time to get her into bed and call a doctor before she died." "Well?" Helen inquired. "There'll have to be an inquest," said St. John. Why had she done it? He shrugged his shoulders. Why do people kill themselves? Why do the lower orders do anything of the things they do? Nobody knows. They sat in silence. "The bell's rung 15 minutes, and they're not down," said Helen at length. When they appeared, St. John explained why it had been necessary for him to come to luncheon. He imitated Evelyn's enthusiastic tone as she confronted him in the smoking room. "She thinks there can be nothing quite so thrilling as mathematics, so I've lent her a large work in 2 volumes. It'll be interesting to see what she makes of it." Rachel could now afford to laugh at him. She reminded him of Gibbon. She had the first volume somewhere still. If he were undertaking the education of Evelyn, that surely was the test. Or she had heard that Burke upon the American Rebellion. Evelyn ought to read them both simultaneously. When St. John had disposed of her argument and had satisfied his hunger, he proceeded to tell them that the hotel was seething with scandals, some of the most appalling kind, which had happened in their absence. He was indeed much given to the study of his kind. Evelyn M., for example, but that was told me in confidence. "Nonsense!" Terence interposed. "You've heard about poor Sinclair too?" "Oh yes, I've heard about Sinclair. He's retired to his mine with a revolver. He writes to Evelyn daily, and he's thinking of committing suicide. I've assured her that he's never been so happy in his life, and on the whole she's inclined to agree with me." "But then she's entangled herself with Perrott," St. John continued, "and I have reason to think, from something I saw in the passage, that everything isn't as it should be between Arthur and Susan. There's a young female lately arrived from Manchester, a very good thing if it were broken off, in my opinion. Their married life is something too horrible to contemplate. Oh, and I distinctly heard old Mrs. Paley rapping out the most fearful oaths as I passed her bedroom door. It's supposed that she tortures her maid in private. It's practically certain she does. One can tell it from the look in her eyes." "When you're 80 and the gout tweezes you, you'll be swearing like a trooper," Terence remarked. "You'll be very fat, very testy, very disagreeable. Can't you imagine him, bald as a coot, with a pair of sponge-bag trousers, a little spotted tie, and a corporation?" After a pause Hurst remarked that the worst infamy has still to be told. He addressed himself to Helen. "They've hoofed out the prostitute. One night, while we were away, that old numbskull, Thornbury, was doddering about the passages very late. Nobody seems to have asked him what he was up to. He saw the Signora Lola Mendoza, as she calls herself, cross the passage in her nightgown. He communicated his suspicions next morning to Elliot, with the result that Rodriguez went to the woman and gave her 24 hours in which to clear out of the place. No one seems to have inquired into the truth of the story, or to have asked Thornbury and Elliot what business it was of theirs. They had it entirely their own way. I propose that we should all sign a round robin, go to Rodriguez in a body, and insist upon a full inquiry. Something's got to be done. Don't you agree?" Hewitt remarked that there could be no doubt as to the lady's profession. "Still," he added, "it's a great shame, poor woman. Only I don't see what's to be done." "I quite agree with you, St. John," Helen burst out. "It's monstrous. The hypocritical smugness of the English makes my blood boil. A man who's made a fortune in trade, as Mr. Thornbury has, is bound to be twice as bad as any prostitute." She respected St. John's morality, which she took far more seriously than anyone else did, and now entered into a discussion with him as to the steps that were to be taken to enforce their peculiar view of what was right. The argument led to some profoundly gloomy statements of a general nature. Who were they, after all? What authority had they? What power against the mass of superstition and ignorance? It was the English, of course. There must be something wrong in the English blood. Directly you met an English person of the middle classes, you were conscious of an indefinable sensation of loathing. Directly you saw the brown crescent of houses above Dover, the same thing came over you. But unfortunately, St. John added, you couldn't trust these foreigners. They were interrupted by sounds of strife at the further end of the table. Rachel appealed to her aunt. "Terence says we must go to tea with Mrs. Thornbury because she's been so kind, but I don't see it. In fact, I'd rather have my right hand sawn in pieces. Just imagine the eyes of all those women." "Fiddlesticks, Rachel," Terence replied. "Who wants to look at you? You're consumed with vanity. You're a monster of conceit. Surely, Helen, you ought to have taught her by this time that she's a person of no conceivable importance whatever, not beautiful, or well-dressed, or conspicuous for elegance or intellect, or deportment. A more ordinary sight than you are," he concluded, "except for the tear across your dress, has never been seen. However, stay at home if you want to. I'm going." She appealed again to her aunt. It wasn't the being looked at, she explained, but the things people were sure to say, the women in particular. She liked women, but where emotion was concerned they were as flies on a lump of sugar. They would be certain to ask her questions. Evelyn M. would say, "Are you in love? Is it nice being in love?" And Mrs. Thornbury, her eyes would go up and down, up and down. She shuddered at the thought of it. Indeed, the retirement of their life since their engagement had made her so sensitive that she was not exaggerating her case. She found an ally in Helen, who proceeded to expound her views of the human race, as she regarded with complacency the pyramid of variegated fruits in the centre of the table. It wasn't that they were cruel, or meant to hurt, or even stupid exactly, but she had always found that the ordinary person had so little emotion in his own life that the scent of it in the lives of others was like the scent of blood in the nostrils of a bloodhound. Warming to the theme, she continued, "Directly anything happens, it may be a marriage, or a birth, or a death, on the whole they prefer it to be a death, everyone wants to see you. They insist upon seeing you. They've got nothing to say. They don't care a rap for you. But you've got to go to lunch, or to tea, or to dinner, and if you don't, you're damned. It's the smell of blood," she continued. "I don't blame 'em, only they shan't have mine if I know it." She looked about her as if she had called up a legion of human beings, all hostile and all disagreeable, who encircled the table, with mouths gaping for blood, and made it appear a little island of neutral country in the midst of the enemy's country. Her words roused her husband, who had been muttering rhythmically to himself, surveying his guests and his food and his wife with eyes that were now melancholy and now fierce, according to the fortunes of the lady in his ballad. He cut Helen short with a protest. He hated even the semblance of cynicism in women. "Nonsense, nonsense!" he remarked abruptly. Terence and Rachel glanced at each other across the table, which meant that when they were married they would not behave like that. The entrance of Ridley into the conversation had a strange effect. It became at once more formal and more polite. It would have been impossible to talk quite easily of anything that came into their heads, and to say the word prostitute as simply as any other word. The talk now turned upon literature and politics, and Ridley told stories of the distinguished people he had known in his youth. Such talk was of the nature of an art, and the personalities and informalities of the young were silenced. As they rose to go, Helen stopped for a moment, leaning her elbows on the table. "You've all been sitting here," she said, "for almost an hour, and you haven't noticed my figs, or my flowers, or the way the light comes through, or anything. I haven't been listening, because I've been looking at you. You're all very beautiful. I wish you'd go on sitting for ever." She led the way to the drawing-room, where she took up her embroidery and began again to dissuade Terence from walking down to the hotel in this heat. But the more she dissuaded, the more he was determined to go. He became irritated and obstinate. There were moments when they almost disliked each other. He wanted other people, he wanted Rachel, to see them with him. He suspected that Mrs. Ambrose would now try to dissuade her from going. He was annoyed by all this space and shade and beauty, and Hurst, recumbent, drooping a magazine from his wrist. "I'm going," he repeated. "Rachel needn't come unless she wants to." "If you go, Hewitt, I wish you'd make inquiries about the prostitute," said Hurst. "Look here," he added, "I'll walk half the way with you." Greatly to their surprise, he raised himself, looked at his watch, and remarked that, as it was now half an hour since luncheon, the gastric juices had had sufficient time to secrete. He was trying a system, he explained, which involved short spells of exercise, interspaced by longer intervals of rest. "I shall be back at 4," he remarked to Helen, "when I shall lie down on the sofa and relax all my muscles completely." "So you're going, Rachel?" Helen asked. "You won't stay with me?" She smiled, but she might have been sad. Was she sad, or was she really laughing? Rachel could not tell, and she felt for the moment very uncomfortable between Helen and Terence. Then she turned away, saying merely that she would go with Terence, on condition that he did all the talking. A narrow border of shadow ran along the road, which was broad enough for two, but not broad enough for three. St. John therefore dropped a little behind the pair, and the distance between them increased by degrees. Walking with a view to digestion, and with one eye upon his watch, he looked from time to time at the pair in front of him. They seemed to be so happy, so intimate, although they were walking side by side as much as other people walk. They turned slightly toward each other now and then, and said something which he thought must be something very private. They were really disputing about Helen's character, and Terence was trying to explain why it was that she annoyed him so much sometimes. But St. John thought that they were saying things which they did not want him to hear, and was led to think of his own isolation. These people were happy, and in some ways he despised them for being made happy so simply, and in other ways he envied them. He was much more remarkable than they were, but he was not happy. People never liked him. He doubted sometimes whether even Helen liked him. To be simple, to be able to say simply what one felt, without the terrific self-consciousness which possessed him, and showed him his own face and words perpetually in a mirror, that would be worth almost any other gift, for it made one happy. Happiness, happiness. What was happiness? He was never happy. He saw too clearly the little vices and deceits and flaws of life, and seeing them, it seemed to him honest to take notice of them. That was the reason, no doubt, why people generally disliked him, and complained that he was heartless and bitter. Certainly they never told him the things he wanted to be told, that he was nice and kind, and that they liked him. But it was true that half the sharp things that he said about them were said because he was unhappy or hurt himself. But he admitted that he had very seldom told anyone that he cared for them, and when he had been demonstrative, he had generally regretted it afterwards. His feelings about Terence and Rachel were so complicated that he had never yet been able to bring himself to say that he was glad that they were going to be married. He saw their faults so clearly, and the inferior nature of a great deal of their feeling for each other, and he expected that their love would not last. He looked at them again, and very strangely, for he was so used to thinking that he seldom saw anything. The look of them filled him with a simple emotion of affection, in which there were some traces of pity also. What, after all, did people's faults matter in comparison with what was good in them? He resolved that he would now tell them what he felt. He quickened his pace and came up with them just as they reached the corner where the lane joined the main road. They stood still and began to laugh at him, and to ask whether the gastric juices, but he stopped them and began to speak very quickly and stiffly. "Do you remember the morning after the dance?" he demanded. "It was here we sat, and you talked nonsense, and Rachel made little heaps of stones. I, on the other hand, had the whole meaning of life revealed to me in a flash." He paused for a second, and drew his lips together in a tight little purse. "Love," he said, "it seems to me to explain everything. So, on the whole, I'm very glad that you two are going to be married." He then turned round abruptly, without looking at them, and walked back to the villa. He felt both exalted and ashamed of himself for having thus said what he felt. Probably they were laughing at him, probably they thought him a fool, and after all, had he really said what he felt? It was true that they laughed when he was gone, but the dispute about Helen, which had become rather sharp, ceased, and they became peaceful and friendly. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Voyage Out by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. They reached the hotel rather early in the afternoon, so that most people were still lying down, or sitting speechless in their bedrooms, and Mrs. Thornbury, although she had asked them to tea, was nowhere to be seen. They sat down, therefore, in the shady hall, which was almost empty, and full of the light swishing sounds of air going to and fro in a large empty space. Yes, this armchair was the same armchair in which Rachel had sat that afternoon when Evelyn came up, and this was the magazine she had been looking at, and this the very picture, a picture of New York by lamplight. How odd it seemed! Nothing had changed. By degrees a certain number of people began to come down the stairs and to pass through the hall, and in this dim light their figures possessed a sort of grace and beauty, although they were all unknown people. Sometimes they went straight through and out into the garden by the swing door, sometimes they stopped for a few minutes and bent over the tables and began turning over the newspapers. Terence and Rachel sat watching them through their half-closed eyelids. The Johnsons, the Parkers, the Baileys, the Simmonses, the Lees, the Morleys, the Campbells, the Gardners. Some were dressed in white flannels and were carrying rackets under their arms, some were short, some tall, some were only children, and some perhaps were servants, but they all had their standing, their reason for following each other through the hall, their money, their position, whatever it might be. Terence soon gave up looking at them, for he was tired, and closing his eyes he fell half asleep in his chair. Rachel watched the people for some time longer. She was fascinated by the certainty and the grace of their movements, and by the inevitable way in which they seemed to follow each other, and loiter and pass on and disappear. But after a time her thoughts wandered, and she began to think of the dance, which had been held in this room. Only then the room itself looked quite different. Glancing round, she could hardly believe that it was the same room. It had looked so bare and so bright and formal on that night when they came into it out of the darkness. It had been filled, too, with little red, excited faces, always moving, and people so brightly dressed and so animated that they did not seem in the least like real people, nor did you feel that you could talk to them. And now the room was dim and quiet, the beautiful silent people passed through it, to whom you could go and say anything you liked. She felt herself amazingly secure as she sat in her armchair, and able to review not only the night of the dance, but the entire past, tenderly and humorously, as if she had been turning in a fog for a long time, and could now see exactly where she had turned. For the methods by which she had reached her present position seemed to her very strange, and the strangest thing about them was that she had not known where they were leading her. That was the strange thing, that one did not know where one was going, or what one wanted, and followed blindly, suffering so much in secret, always unprepared and amazed and knowing nothing. But one thing led to another, and by degrees something had formed itself out of nothing. And so one reached at last this calm, this quiet, this certainty, and it was this process that people called living. Perhaps then everyone really knew, as she knew now, where they were going, and things formed themselves into a pattern not only for her, but for them, and in that pattern lay satisfaction and meaning. When she looked back she could see that a meaning of some kind was apparent in the lives of her aunts, and in the brief visit of the Dalloways, whom she would never see again, and in the life of her father. The sound of Terence breathing deeply in his slumber confirmed her in her calm. She was not sleepy, although she did not see anything very distinctly, and although the figures passing through the hall became vaguer and vaguer, she believed that they all knew exactly where they were going, and the sense of their certainty filled her with comfort. For the moment she was detached and disinterested, as if she had no longer any lot in life, and she thought that she could now accept anything that came to her without being perplexed by the form in which it appeared. What was there to frighten her or to perplex in the prospect of life? Why should this insight ever again desert her? The world was in truth so large, so hospitable, and after all, it was so simple. Love, St. John had said, that seems to explain it all. Yes, but was it not the love of man for woman, of Terence for Rachel? Although they sat so close together, they had ceased to be little separate bodies. They had ceased to struggle and desire one another. There seemed to be peace between them. It might be love, but it was not the love of man for woman. Through her half-closed eyelids she watched Terence lying back in his chair, and she smiled as she saw how big his mouth was, and his chin so small, and his nose curved like a switchback with a knob at the end. Naturally, looking like that, he was lazy and ambitious and full of moods and faults. She remembered their quarrels, and in particular how they had been quarrelling about Helen that very afternoon, and she thought how often they would quarrel in the 30 or 40 or 50 years in which they would be living in the same house together, catching trains together, and getting annoyed because they were so different. But all this was superficial, and had nothing to do with the life that went on beneath the eyes and the mouth and the chin, for that life was independent of her, and independent of everything else. So, too, although she was going to marry him, and to live with him for 30 or 40 or 50 years, and to quarrel, and to be close to him, she was independent of him, she was independent of everything else. Nevertheless, as St. John said, it was love that made her understand this, for she had never felt his independence, this calm, and this certainty until she fell in love with him, and perhaps this, too, was love. She wanted nothing else. For perhaps 2 minutes Miss Allen had been standing at a little distance looking at the couple lying back so peacefully in their armchairs. She could not make up her mind whether to disturb them or not, and then, seeming to recollect something, she came across the hall. The sound of her approach woke Terence, who sat up and rubbed his eyes. He heard Miss Allen talking to Rachel. "Well," she was saying, "this is very nice. It is very nice indeed. Getting engaged seems to be quite the fashion. It cannot often happen that two couples who had never seen each other before meet in the same hotel and decide to get married." Then she paused and smiled, and seemed to have nothing more to say, so that Terence rose and asked her whether it was true that she had finished her book. Someone had said that she had really finished it. Her face lit up. She turned to him with a livelier expression than usual. "Yes, I think I can fairly say I have finished it," she said. "That is, omitting Swinburne. Beowulf to Browning. I rather like the B's myself. Beowulf to Browning," she repeated. "I think that is the kind of title which might catch one's eye on a railway bookstall." She was indeed very proud that she had finished her book, for no one knew what an amount of determination had gone to the making of it. Also she thought that it was a good piece of work, and considering what anxiety she had been in about her brother while she wrote it, she could not resist telling them a little more about it. "I must confess," she continued, "that if I had known how many classics there are in English literature, and how verbose the best of them contrive to be, I should never have undertaken the work. They only allow one 70,000 words, you see." "Only 70,000 words!" Terence exclaimed. "Yes, and one has to say something about everybody," Miss Allen added. "That is what I find so difficult, saying something different about everybody." Then she thought that she had said enough about herself, and she asked whether they had come down to join the tennis tournament. "The young people are very keen about it. It begins again in half an hour." Her gaze rested benevolently upon them both, and, after a momentary pause, she remarked, looking at Rachel as if she had remembered something that would serve to keep her distinct from other people, "You're the remarkable person who doesn't like ginger." But the kindness of the smile in her rather worn and courageous face made them feel that although she would scarcely remember them as individuals, she had laid upon them the burden of the new generation. "And in that I quite agree with her," said a voice behind. Mrs. Thornbury had overheard the last few words about not liking ginger. "It's associated in my mind with a horrid old aunt of ours. Poor thing, she suffered dreadfully, so it isn't fair to call her horrid, who used to give it to us when we were small, and we never had the courage to tell her we didn't like it. We had just to put it in the shrubbery. She had a big house near Bath." They began moving slowly across the hall, when they were stopped by the impact of Evelyn, who dashed into them, as though in running downstairs to catch them her legs had got beyond her control. "Well," she exclaimed, with her usual enthusiasm, seizing Rachel by the arm, "I call this splendid! I guessed it was going to happen from the very beginning. I saw you two were made for each other. Now you've just got to tell me all about it. When's it to be? Where are you going to live? Are you both tremendously happy?" But the attention of the group was diverted to Mrs. Elliot, who was passing them with her eager but uncertain movement, carrying in her hands a plate and an empty hot water bottle. She would have passed them, but Mrs. Thornbury went up and stopped her. "Thank you, Hewlett's better," she replied, in answer to Mrs. Thornbury's inquiry, "but he's not an easy patient. He wants to know what his temperature is, and if I tell him he gets anxious, and if I don't tell him he suspects. You know what men are when they're ill. And, of course, there are none of the proper appliances, and, though he seems very willing and anxious to help," here she lowered her voice mysteriously, "one can't feel that Dr. Rodriguez is the same as a proper doctor. If you would come and see him, Mr. Hewett," she added, "I know it would cheer him up, lying there in bed all day, and the flies. But I must go and find Angelo. The food here, of course, with an invalid, one wants things particularly nice," and she hurried past them in search of the head waiter. The worry of nursing her husband had fixed a plaintive frown upon her forehead. She was pale and looked unhappy, and more than usually inefficient, and her eyes wandered more vaguely than ever from point to point. "Poor thing!" Mrs. Thornbury exclaimed. She told them that for some days Hewling Elliot had been ill, and the only doctor available was the brother of the proprietor, or so the proprietor said, whose right to the title of doctor was not above suspicion. "I know how wretched it is to be ill in a hotel," Mrs. Thornbury remarked, once more leading the way with Rachel to the garden. "I spent 6 weeks on my honeymoon in having typhoid in Venice," she continued. "I look back upon them as some of the happiest weeks in my life. Ah, yes," she said, taking Rachel's arm, "you think yourself happy now, but it's nothing to the happiness that comes afterwards, and I assure you I could find it in my heart to envy you young people. You've a much better time than we had, I may tell you. When I look back upon it, I can hardly believe how things have changed. When we were engaged, I wasn't allowed to go for walks with William alone. Someone had to always be in the room with us. I really believe I had to show my parents all his letters, though they were very fond of him too. Indeed, I may say they looked upon him as their own son. It amuses me," she continued, "to think how strict they were to us, when I see how they spoil their grandchildren." The table was laid under the tree again, and taking her place before the teacups, Mrs. Thornbury beckoned and nodded until she had collected quite a number of people, Susan and Arthur and Mr. Pepper, who were strolling about, waiting for the tournament to begin. A murmuring tree, a river brimming in the moonlight, Terence's words, came back to Rachel as she sat drinking the tea and listening to the words which flowed on so lightly, so kindly, and with such silvery smoothness. This long life and all these children had left her very smooth. They seemed to have rubbed away the marks of individuality, and to have left only what was old and maternal. "And the things you young people are going to see," Mrs. Thornbury continued. She included them all in her forecast. She included them all in her maternity, although the party comprised William Pepper and Miss Allen, both of whom might have been supposed to have seen a fair share of the panorama. "When I see how the world has changed in my lifetime," she went on, "I can see no limit to what may happen in the next 50 years. Ah, no, Mr. Pepper, I don't agree with you in the least," she laughed, interrupting his gloomy remark about things going steadily from bad to worse. "I know I ought to feel that, but I don't, I'm afraid. They're going to be much better people than we were. Surely everything goes to prove that. All round me I see women, young women, women with household cares of every sort, going out and doing things that we should not have thought it possible to do." Mr. Pepper thought her sentimental and irrational, like all old women, but her manner of treating him as if he were a cross old baby baffled him and charmed him, and he could only reply to her with a curious grimace which was more a smile than a frown. "And they remain women," Mrs. Thornbury added. "They give a great deal to their children." As she said this she smiled slightly in the direction of Susan and Rachel. They did not like to be included in the same lot, but they both smiled a little self-consciously, and Arthur and Terence glanced at each other too. She made them feel that they were all in the same boat together, and they looked at the women they were going to marry and compared them. It was inexplicable how anyone could wish to marry Rachel, incredible that anyone should be ready to spend his life with Susan. But singular though the others' taste must be, they bore each other no ill will on account of it. Indeed, they liked each other rather the better for the eccentricity of their choice. "I really must congratulate you," Susan remarked as she leant across the table for the jam. There seemed to be no foundation for St. John's gossip about Arthur and Susan. Sunburnt and vigorous they sat side by side, with their rackets across their knees, not saying much, but smiling slightly all the time. Through the thin white clothes which they wore, it was possible to see the lines of their bodies and legs, the beautiful curves of their muscles, his leanness and her flesh, and it was natural to think of the firm-fleshed, sturdy children that would be theirs. Their faces had too little shape in them to be beautiful, but they had clear eyes and an appearance of great health and power of endurance, for it seemed as if the blood would never cease to run in his veins or to lie deeply and calmly in her cheeks. Their eyes at the present moment were brighter than usual, and wore the peculiar expression of pleasure and self-confidence which is seen in the eyes of athletes, for they had been playing tennis, and they were both first-rate at the game. Evelyn had not spoken, but she had been looking from Susan to Rachel. Well, they had both made up their minds very easily. They had done in a few weeks what it sometimes seemed to her that she would never be able to do. Although they were so different, she thought that she could see in each the same look of satisfaction and completion, the same calmness of manner, and the same slowness of movement. It was that slowness, that confidence, that content which she hated, she thought to herself. They moved so slowly because they were not single but double, and Susan was attached to Arthur and Rachel to Terence, and for the sake of this one man they had renounced all other men and movement and the real things of life. Love was all very well, and those snug domestic houses, with the kitchen below and the nursery above, which were so secluded and self-contained, like little islands in the torrents of the world. But the real things were surely the things that happened, the causes, the wars, the ideals which happened in the great world outside, and went so independently of these women, turning so quietly and beautifully towards the men. She looked at them sharply. Of course they were happy and content, but there must be better things than that. Surely one could get nearer to life, one could get more out of life, one could enjoy more than they would ever do. Rachel in particular looked so young. What could she know of life? She became restless, and getting up, crossed over to sit beside Rachel. She reminded her that she had promised to join her club. "The bother is," she went on, "that I mayn't be able to start work seriously till October. I've just had a letter from a friend of mine whose brother is in business in Moscow. They want me to stay with them, and as they're in the thick of all the conspiracies and anarchists, I've a good mind to stop on my way home. It sounds too thrilling." She wanted to make Rachel see how thrilling it was. "My friend knows a girl of 15 who's been sent to Siberia for life, merely because they caught her addressing a letter to an anarchist. And the letter wasn't from her either. I'd give all I have in the world to help on a revolution against the Russian government, and it's bound to come." She looked from Rachel to Terence. They were both a little touched by the sight of her remembering how lately they had been listening to evil words about her, and Terence asked what her scheme was, and she explained that she was going to found a club for doing things, really doing them. She became very animated as she talked on and on, for she professed herself certain that if once 20 people, no, 10 would be enough if they were keen, set about doing things instead of talking about them, she could abolish almost every evil that exists. It was brains that were needed. If only people with brains. Of course, they would want a nice room, in Bloomsbury preferably, where they could meet once a week. As she talked, Terence could see the traces of fading youth in her face, the lines that were being drawn by talk and excitement round her mouth and eyes. But he did not pity her, looking into those bright, rather hard and very courageous eyes. He saw that she did not pity herself, or feel any desire to exchange her own life for the more refined and orderly lives of people like himself and St. John, although, as the years went by, the fight would become harder and harder. Perhaps, though, she would settle down. Perhaps, after all, she would marry Perrott. While his mind was half occupied with what she was saying, he thought of her probable destiny, the light clouds of tobacco smoke serving to obscure his face from her eyes. Terence smoked, and Arthur smoked, and Evelyn smoked, so that the air was full of the mist and fragrance of good tobacco. In the intervals when no one spoke, they heard far off the low murmur of the sea, as the waves quietly broke and spread the beach with a film of water, and withdrew to break again. The cool green light fell through the leaves of the tree, and there were soft crescents and diamonds of sunshine upon the plates and the tablecloth. Mrs. Thornbury, after watching them all for some time in silence, began to ask Rachel kindly questions. When did they all go back? Oh, they expected her father. She must want to see her father. There would be a great deal to tell him, and, she looked sympathetically at Terence, he would be so happy, she felt sure. Years ago, she continued, it might have been 10 or 20 years ago, she remembered meeting Mr. Vinrace at a party, and being so much struck by his face, which was so unlike the ordinary face one sees at a party, that she had asked who he was, and she was told that it was Mr. Vinrace, and she had always remembered the name, an uncommon name, and he had a lady with him, a very sweet-looking woman, but it was one of those dreadful London crushes where you don't talk, you only look at each other, and although she had shaken hands with Mr. Vinrace, she didn't think they had said anything. She sighed very slightly, remembering the past. Then she turned to Mr. Pepper, who had become very dependent on her, so that he always chose a seat near her, and attended to what she was saying, although he did not often make any remark of his own. "You who know everything, Mr. Pepper," she said, "tell us how did those wonderful French ladies manage their salons? Did we ever do anything of the same kind in England, or do you think that there is some reason why we cannot do it in England?" Mr. Pepper was pleased to explain very accurately why there has never been an English salon. There were 3 reasons, and they were very good ones, he said. As for himself, when he went to a party, as one was sometimes obliged to do, from a wish not to give offence, his niece, for example, had been married the other day, he walked into the middle of the room, said "Ha, ha!" as loud as ever he could, considered that he had done his duty, and walked away again. Mrs. Thornbury protested. She was going to give a party directly she got back, and they were all to be invited, and she should set people to watch Mr. Pepper, and if she heard that he had been caught saying "Ha, ha!" she would do something very dreadful indeed to him. Arthur Venning suggested that what she must do was to rig up something in the nature of a surprise, a portrait, for example, of a nice old lady in a lace cap, concealing a bath of cold water, which at a signal could be sprung on Pepper's head, or they'd have a chair which shot him 20 feet high directly he sat on it. Susan laughed. She had done her tea. She was feeling very well contented, partly because she had been playing tennis brilliantly, and then everyone was so nice. She was beginning to find it so much easier to talk, and to hold her own even with quite clever people, for somehow clever people did not frighten her any more. Even Mr. Hurst, whom she had disliked when she first met him, really wasn't disagreeable. And poor man, he always looked so ill. Perhaps he was in love. Perhaps he had been in love with Rachel. She really shouldn't wonder. Or perhaps it was Evelyn. She was of course very attractive to men. Leaning forward, she went on with the conversation. She said that she thought that the reason why parties were so dull was mainly because gentlemen will not dress. Even in London, she stated, it struck her very much how people didn't think it necessary to dress in the evening. And of course if they didn't dress in London, they won't dress in the country. It was really quite a treat at Christmas time, when there were the hunt balls, and the gentlemen wore nice red coats. But Arthur didn't care for dancing, so she supposed that they wouldn't go even to the ball in their little country town. She didn't think that people who were fond of one sport often care for another, although her father was an exception. But then he was an exception in every way. Such a gardener, and he knew all about birds and animals, and of course he was simply adored by all the old women in the village. And at the same time, what he really liked best was a book. You always knew where to find him if he were wanted. He would be in his study with a book. Very likely it would be an old, old book, some fusty old thing that no one else would dream of reading. She used to tell him that he would have made a first-rate old bookworm if only he hadn't had a family of 6 to support. And 6 children, she added, charmingly confident of universal sympathy, didn't leave one much time for being a bookworm. Still talking about her father, of whom she was very proud, she rose, for Arthur, upon looking at his watch, found that it was time they went back again to the tennis court. The others did not move. "They're very happy," said Mrs. Thornbury, looking benignantly after them. Rachel agreed. They seemed to be so certain of themselves. They seemed to know exactly what they wanted. "Do you think they are happy?" Evelyn murmured to Terence in an undertone, and she hoped that he would say that he did not think them happy. But instead he said that they must go too. Go home, for they were always being late for meals, and Mrs. Ambrose, who was very stern and particular, didn't like that. Evelyn laid hold of Rachel's skirt and protested. Why should they go? It was still early, and she had so many things to say to them. "No," said Terence, "we must go, because we walk so slowly. We stop and look at things, and we talk." "What do you talk about?" Evelyn inquired, upon which he laughed and said that they talked about everything. Mrs. Thornbury went with them to the gate, trailing very slowly and gracefully across the grass and the gravel, and talking all the time about flowers and birds. She told them that she had taken up the study of botany since her daughter married, and it was wonderful what a number of flowers there were which she had never seen, although she had lived in the country all her life, and she was now 72. It was a good thing to have some occupation which was quite independent of other people, she said, when one got old. But the odd thing was that one never felt old. She always felt that she was 25, not a day more or a day less. But of course one couldn't expect other people to agree to that. "It must be very wonderful to be 25 and not merely to imagine that you're 25, she said, looking from one to the other with her smooth, bright glance. "It must be very wonderful indeed." She stood talking to them at the gate for a long time. She seemed reluctant that they should go. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Voyage Out by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. The afternoon was very hot, so hot that the breaking of the waves on the shore sounded like the repeated sigh of some exhausted creature, and even on the terrace under an awning the bricks were hot, and the air danced perpetually over the short dry grass. The red flowers in the stone basins were drooping with the heat, and the white blossoms which had been so smooth and thick only a few weeks ago were now dry, and their edges were curled and yellow. Only the stiff and hostile plants of the south, whose fleshy leaves seemed to be grown upon spines, still remained standing upright and defied the sun to beat them down. It was too hot to talk, and it was not easy to find any book that would withstand the power of the sun. Many books had been tried and then let fall, and now Terence was reading Milton aloud, because he said the words of Milton had substance and shape, so that it was not necessary to understand what he was saying. One could merely listen to his words, one could almost handle them. "There is a gentle nymph not far from hence," he read, "that with moist curb sways the smooth Severn stream. Sabrina is her name, a virgin pure. Whilom she was the daughter of Locrine, that had the sceptre from his father brute." The words, in spite of what Terence had said, seemed to be laden with meaning, and perhaps it was for this reason that it was painful to listen to them. They sounded strange, they meant different things from what they usually meant. Rachel, at any rate, could not keep her attention fixed upon them, but went off upon curious trains of thought suggested by words such as curb and Locrine and brute, which brought unpleasant sights before her eyes, independently of their meaning. Owing to the heat and the dancing air, the garden, too, looked strange. The trees were either too near or too far, and her head almost certainly ached. She was not quite certain, and therefore she did not know, whether to tell Terence now, or to let him go on reading. She decided that she would wait until he came to the end of a stanza, and if by that time she had turned her head this way and that, and it ached in every position undoubtedly, she would say very calmly that her head ached. "Sabrina fair, listen where thou art sitting, under the glassy, cool, translucent wave, in twisted braids of lilies knitting the loose train of thy amber dropping hair. Listen for dear honour's sake, goddess of the silver lake, listen and save." But her head ached. It ached whichever way she turned. She sat up and said, as she had determined, "My head aches, so that I shall go indoors." He was half-way through the next verse, but he dropped the book instantly. "Your head aches?" he repeated. For a few moments they sat looking at one another in silence, holding each other's hands. During this time his sense of dismay and catastrophe were almost physically painful. All round him he seemed to hear the shiver of broken glass which, as it fell to earth, left him sitting in the open air. But at the end of 2 minutes, noticing that she was not sharing his dismay, but was only rather more languid and heavy-eyed than usual, he recovered, fetched Helen, and asked her to tell him what they had better do, for Rachel had a headache. Mrs. Ambrose was not discomposed, but advised that she should go to bed, and added that she must expect her head to ache if she sat up to all hours and went out in the heat, but a few hours in bed would cure it completely. Terence was unreasonably reassured by her words, as he had been unreasonably depressed the moment before. Helen's sense seemed to have much in common with the ruthless good sense of nature, which avenged rashness by a headache, and, like nature's good sense, might be depended upon. Rachel went to bed. She lay in the dark, it seemed to her, for a very long time, but at length, waking from a transparent kind of sleep, she saw the windows white in front of her, and recollected that some time before she had gone to bed with a headache, and that Helen had said it would be gone when she woke. She supposed, therefore, that she was now quite well again. At the same time the wall of her room was painfully white, and curved slightly instead of being straight and flat. Turning her eyes to the window, she was not reassured by what she saw there. The movement of the blind as it filled with air and blew slowly out, drawing the cord with a little trailing sound along the floor, seemed to her terrifying, as if it were the movement of an animal in the room. She shut her eyes, and the pulse in her head beat so strongly that each thump seemed to tread upon a nerve, piercing her forehead with a little stab of pain. It might not be the same headache, but she certainly had a headache. She turned from side to side in the hope that the coolness of the sheets would cure her, and that when she next opened her eyes to look, the room would be as usual. After a considerable number of vain experiments, she resolved to put the matter beyond a doubt. She got out of bed and stood upright, holding on to the brass ball at the end of the bedstead. Ice cold at first, it soon became as hot as the palm of her hand, and as the pains in her head and body, and the instability of the floor, proved that it would be far more intolerable to stand and walk than to lie in bed, she got into bed again. And though the change was refreshing at first, the discomfort of bed was soon as great as the discomfort of standing up. She accepted the idea that she would have to stay in bed all day long, and as she laid her head on the pillow, relinquished the happiness of the day. When Helen came in an hour or two later, suddenly stopped her cheerful words, looked startled for a second, and then unnaturally calm, the fact that she was ill was put beyond a doubt. It was confirmed when the whole household knew of it, when the song that someone was singing in the garden stopped suddenly, and when Maria, as she brought water, slipped past the bed with averted eyes. There was all the morning to get through, and then all the afternoon, and at intervals she made an effort to cross over into the ordinary world, but she found that her heat and discomfort had put a gulf between her world and the ordinary world which she could not bridge. At one point the door opened, and Helen came in with a little dark man who had—it was the chief thing she noticed about him—very hairy hands. She was drowsy and intolerably hot, and as he seemed shy and obsequious, she scarcely troubled to answer him, although she understood that he was a doctor. At another point the door opened, and Terence came in very gently, smiling too steadily, as she realized, for it to be natural. He sat down and talked to her, stroking her hand until it became irksome to her to lie any more in the same position, and she turned round, and when she looked up again, Helen was beside her and Terence had gone. It did not matter, she would see him tomorrow when things would be ordinary again. Her chief occupation during the day was to try to remember how the lines went. Under the glassy, cool, translucent wave, in twisted braids of lilies knitting the loose train of thy amber dropping hair. And the effort worried her because the adjectives persisted in getting into the wrong places. The second day did not differ very much from the first day, except that her bed had become very important, and the world outside, when she tried to think of it, appeared distinctly further off. The glassy, cool, translucent wave was almost visible before her, curling up at the end of the bed, and as it was refreshingly cool, she tried to keep her mind fixed upon it. Helen was there, and Helen was there all day long. Sometimes she said that it was lunch-time, and sometimes that it was tea-time, but by the next day all landmarks were obliterated, and the outer world was so far away that the different sounds, such as the sounds of people moving overhead, could only be ascribed to their cause by a great effort of memory. The recollection of what she had felt, or of what she had been doing and thinking 3 days before, had faded entirely. On the other hand, every object in the room, and the bed itself, and her own body with its various limbs and their different sensations were more and more important each day. She was completely cut off, and unable to communicate with the rest of the world, isolated alone with her body. Hours and hours would pass thus, without getting any further through the morning, or again a few minutes would lead from broad daylight to the depths of the night. One evening when the room appeared very dim, either because it was evening or because the blinds were drawn, Helen said to her, "Someone is going to sit here to-night. You won't mind?" Opening her eyes, Rachel saw not only Helen, but a nurse in spectacles, whose face vaguely recalled something that she had once seen. She had seen her in the chapel. "Nurse McInnes," said Helen, and the nurse smiled steadily, as they all did, and said that she did not find many people who were frightened of her. After waiting for a moment they both disappeared, and having turned on her pillow, Rachel woke to find herself in the midst of one of those interminable nights which do not end at 12, but go on into the double figures, 13, 14, and so on, until they reach the 20s, and then the 30s, and then the 40s. She realized that there is nothing to prevent knights from doing this if they choose. At a great distance an elderly woman sat with her head bent down. Rachel raised herself slightly and saw with dismay that she was playing cards by the light of a candle which stood in the hollow of a newspaper. The sight had something inexplicably sinister about it, and she was terrified and cried out, upon which the woman laid down her cards and came across the room, shading the candle with her hands. Coming nearer and nearer across the great space of the room, she stood at last above Rachel's head and said, "Not asleep? Let me make you comfortable." She put down the candle and began to arrange the bedclothes. It struck Rachel that a woman who sat playing cards in a cavern all night long would have very cold hands, and she shrunk from the touch of them. "Why, there's a toe all the way down there," the woman said, proceeding to tuck in the bedclothes. Rachel did not realise that the toe was hers. "You must try and lie still," she proceeded, "because if you lie still you will be less hot, and if you toss about you will make yourself more hot, and we don't want you to be any hotter than you are." She stood looking down upon Rachel for an enormous length of time. "And the quieter you lie, the sooner you will be well," she repeated. Rachel kept her eyes fixed upon the peaked shadow of the ceiling, and all her energy was concentrated upon the desire that this shadow should move. But the shadow and the woman seemed to be eternally fixed above her. She shut her eyes. When she opened them again, several more hours had passed, but the night still lasted interminably. The woman was still playing cards, only she sat now in a tunnel under a river, and the light stood in a little archway in the wall above her. She cried, "Terence!" and the peaked shadow again moved across the ceiling, as the woman with an enormous slow movement rose, and they both stood still above her. "It's just as difficult to keep you in bed as it was to keep Mr. Forrest in bed," the woman said, "and he was such a tall gentleman." In order to get rid of this terrible stationary sight, Rachel again shut her eyes, and found herself walking through a tunnel under the Thames, where there were little deformed women sitting in archways playing cards, while the bricks of which the wall was made oozed with damp, which collected into drops and slid down the wall. But the little old women became Helen and Nurse Mackinnis, after a time, standing in the window together whispering incessantly. Meanwhile, outside her room, the sounds, the movements, and the lives of the people in the house went on in the ordinary light of the sun, throughout the usual succession of hours. When, on the first day of her illness, it became clear that she would not be absolutely well, for her temperature was very high, until Friday, that day being Tuesday, Terence was filled with resentment, not against her, but against the force outside them which was separating them. He counted up the number of days that would almost certainly be spoilt for them. He realized, with an odd mixture of pleasure and annoyance, that, for the first time in his life, he was so dependent upon another person that his happiness was in her keeping. The days were completely wasted upon trifling immaterial things, for after 3 weeks of such intimacy and intensity, all the usual occupations were unbearably flat and beside the point. The least intolerable occupation was to talk to St. John about Rachel's illness, and to discuss every symptom and its meaning, and, when this subject was exhausted, to discuss illness of all kinds, and what caused them, and what cured them. Twice every day he went in to sit with Rachel, and twice every day the same thing happened. On going into her room, which was not very dark, where the music was lying about as usual, and her books and letters, his spirits rose instantly. When he saw her he felt completely reassured. She did not look very ill. Sitting by her side, he would tell her what he had been doing, using his natural voice to speak to her, only a few tones lower down than usual. But by the time he had sat there for 5 minutes, he was plunged into the deepest gloom. She was not the same. He could not bring them back to their old relationship. But although he knew that it was foolish, He could not prevent himself from endeavouring to bring her back, to make her remember, and when this failed he was in despair. He always concluded as he left her room that it was worse to see her than not to see her. But by degrees, as the day wore on, the desire to see her returned and became almost too great to be borne. On Thursday morning, when Terence went into her room, he felt the usual increase of confidence. She turned round and made an effort to remember certain facts from the world that was so many millions of miles away. "You have come up from the hotel?" she asked. "No, I'm staying here for the present," he said. "We've just had luncheon," he continued, "and the mail has come in. There's a bundle of letters for you, letters from England." Instead of saying, as he meant her to say, that she wished to see them, she said nothing for some time. "You see, there they go, rolling off the edge of the hill," she said suddenly. "Rolling, Rachel? What do you see rolling? There's nothing rolling." "The old woman with the knife," she replied, not speaking to Terence in particular, and looking past him. As she appeared to be looking at a vase on the shelf opposite, he rose and took it down. "Now they can't roll any more," he said cheerfully. Nevertheless, she lay gazing at the same spot and paid him no further attention, although he spoke to her. He became so profoundly wretched that he could not endure to sit with her, but wandered about until he found St. John, who was reading the Times in the veranda. He laid it aside patiently and heard all that Terence had to say about delirium. He was very patient with Terence. He treated him like a child. By Friday it could not be denied that the illness was no longer an attack that would pass off in a day or two. It was a real illness that required a good deal of organisation, and engrossed the attention of at least 5 people. But there was no reason to be anxious. Instead of lasting 5 days, it was going to last 10 days. Rodriguez was understood to say that there were well-known varieties of this illness. Rodriguez appeared to think that they were treating the illness with undue anxiety. His visits were always marked by the same show of confidence, and in his interviews with Terence he always waved aside his anxious and minute questions with a kind of flourish which seemed to indicate that they were all taking it much too seriously. He seemed curiously unwilling to sit down. "A high temperature," he said, looking furtively about the room, and appearing to be more interested in the furniture and in Helen's embroidery than in anything else. "In this climate you must expect a high temperature. You need not be alarmed by that. It is the pulse we go by." He tapped his own hairy wrist. "And the pulse continues excellent." Thereupon he bowed and slipped out. The interview was conducted laboriously upon both sides in French, and this, together with the fact that he was optimistic, and that Terence respected the medical profession from hearsay, made him less critical than he would have been had he encountered the doctor in any other capacity. Unconsciously he took Rodriguez's side against Helen, who seemed to have taken an unreasonable prejudice against him. When Saturday came it was evident that the hours of the day must be more strictly organised than they had been. St. John offered his services. He said that he had nothing to do and that he might as well spend the day at the villa if he could be of use. As if they were starting on a difficult expedition together, they parcelled out the duties between them, writing out an elaborate scheme of hours upon a large sheet of paper, which was pinned to the drawing-room door. Their distance from the town, and the difficulty of procuring rare things with unknown names from the most unexpected places, made it necessary to think very carefully, and they found it unexpectedly difficult to do the simple but practical things that were required of them, as if they, being very tall, were asked to stoop down and arrange minute grains of sand in a pattern on the ground. It was St. John's duty to fetch what was needed from the town, so that Terence would sit all through the long hot hours alone in the drawing-room, near the open door, listening for any movement upstairs, or call from Helen. He always forgot to pull down the blinds, so that he sat in bright sunshine, which worried him without his knowing what was the cause of it. The room was terribly stiff and uncomfortable. There were hats in the chairs and medicine bottles among the books. He tried to read, but good books were too good and bad books were too bad, and the only thing he could tolerate was the newspaper, which with its news of London and the movements of real people who were giving dinner parties and making speeches, seemed to give a little background of reality to what was otherwise mere nightmare. Then, just as his attention was fixed on the print, a soft call would come from Helen, or Mrs. Chailey would bring in something which was wanted upstairs, and he would run up very quietly in his socks and put the jug on the little table which stood crowded with jugs and cups outside the bedroom door. Or if he could catch Helen for a moment, he would ask, "How is she?" "Rather restless. On the whole, quieter, I think." The answer would be one or the other. As usual, she seemed to reserve something which she did not say, and Terence was conscious that they disagreed and, without saying it aloud, were arguing against each other, but she was too hurried and preoccupied to talk. The strain of listening, and the effort of making practical arrangements and seeing that things worked smoothly, absorbed all Terence's power. Involved in this long, dreary nightmare, he did not attempt to think what it amounted to. Rachel was ill, that was all. He must see that there was medicine and milk, and that things were ready when they were wanted. Thought had ceased. Life itself had come to a standstill. Sunday was rather worse than Saturday had been, simply because the strain was a little greater every day, although nothing else had changed. The separate feelings of pleasure, interest, and pain, which combined to make up the ordinary day, were merged in one long-drawn sensation of sordid misery and profound boredom. He had never been so bored since he was shut up in the nursery alone as a child. The vision of Rachel, as she was now, confused and heedless, had almost obliterated the vision of her as she had been once long ago. He could hardly believe that they had ever been happy, or engaged to be married. For what were feelings? What was there to be felt? Confusion covered every sight and person, and he seemed to see St. John, Ridley, and the stray people who came up now and then from the hotel to inquire, through a mist. The only people who were not hidden in this mist were Helen and Rodriguez, because they could tell him something definite about Rachel. Nevertheless, the day followed the usual forms. At certain hours they went into the dining-room, and when they sat round the table they talked about different things. St. John usually made it his business to start the talk and to keep it from dying out. "I've discovered the way to get Sancho past the White House," said St. John on Sunday at luncheon. "You crackle a piece of paper in his ear, then he bolts for about 100 yards, but he goes on quite well after that." "Yes, but he wants corn. You should see that he has corn." "I don't think much of the stuff they give him, and Angelo seems a dirty little rascal." There was a long silence. Ridley murmured a few lines of poetry under his breath, and remarked, as if to conceal the fact that he had done so, "Very hot to-day." "2 degrees higher than it was yesterday," said St. John. "I wonder where these nuts come from," he observed, taking a nut out of the plate, turning it over in his fingers, and looking at it curiously. "London, I should think," said Terence, looking at the nut too. "A competent man of business could make a fortune here in no time," St. John continued. "I suppose the heat does something funny to people's brains. Even the English go a little queer. Anyhow, they're hopeless people to deal with. They kept me 3/4 of an hour waiting at the chemist's this morning, for no reason whatever." There was another long pause. Then Ridley inquired, "Rodriguez seems satisfied?" "Quite," said Terence with decision. "It's just got to run its course." Whereupon Ridley heaved a deep sigh. He was genuinely sorry for everyone, but at the same time he missed Helen considerably, and was a little aggrieved by the constant presence of the 2 young men. They moved back into the drawing-room. "Look here, Hurst," said Terence, "there's nothing to be done for 2 hours." He consulted the sheet pinned to the door. "You go and lie down. I'll wait here. Chailey sits with Rachel while Helen has her luncheon." It was asking a good deal of Hurst to tell him to go without waiting for a sight of Helen. These little glimpses of Helen were the only respites from strain and boredom, and very often they seemed to make up for the discomfort of the day, although she might not have anything to tell them. However, as they were on an expedition together, he had made up his mind to obey. Helen was very late in coming down. She looked like a person who had been sitting for a long time in the dark. She was pale and thinner, and the expression of her eyes was harassed but determined. She ate her luncheon quickly, and seemed indifferent to what she was doing. She brushed aside Terence's inquiries, and at last, as if he had not spoken, she looked at him with a slight frown, and said: "We can't go on like this, Terence. Either you've got to find another doctor, or you must tell Rodriguez to stop coming, and I'll manage for myself. It's no use for him to say that Rachel's better. She's not better. She's worse." Terence suffered a terrific shock, like that which he had suffered when Rachel said, "My head aches." He stilled it by reflecting that Helen was overwrought, and he was upheld in this opinion by his obstinate sense that she was opposed to him in the argument. "Do you think she is in danger?" he asked. "No one can go on being as ill as that, day after day," she replied. She looked at him, and spoke as if she felt some indignation with somebody. "Very well. I'll talk to Rodriguez this afternoon," he replied. Helen went upstairs at once. Nothing now could assuage Terence's anxiety. He could not read, nor could he sit still, and his sense of security was shaken, in spite of the fact that he was determined that Helen was exaggerating, and that Rachel was not very ill. But he wanted a third person to confirm him in his belief. Directly Rodriguez came down, he demanded: "Well, how is she? Do you think her worse?" "There's no reason for anxiety, I tell you, none," Rodriguez replied in his execrable French, smiling uneasily and making little movements all the time as if to get away. Hewitt stood firmly between him and the door. He was determined to see for himself what kind of man he was. His confidence in the man vanished as he looked at him and saw his insignificance, his dirty appearance, his shiftiness, and his unintelligent, hairy face. It was strange that he had never seen this before. "You won't object, of course, if we ask you to consult another doctor?" he continued. At this the little man became openly incensed. "Ah!" he cried, "you have not confidence in me? You object to my treatment? You wish me to give up the case?" "Not at all," Terence replied, "but in serious illness of this kind—" Rodriguez shrugged his shoulders. "It is not serious, I assure you. You are over-anxious. The young lady is not seriously ill, and I am a doctor. The lady, of course, is frightened," he sneered. "I understand that perfectly." "The name and address of the doctor is—" Terence continued. "There is no other doctor," Rodriguez replied sullenly. "Everyone has confidence in me. Look, I will show you." He took out a packet of old letters and began turning them over, as if in search of one that would confute Terence's suspicions. As he searched, he began to tell a story about an English lord who had trusted him, a great English lord, whose name he had, unfortunately, forgotten. "There is no other doctor in the place," he concluded, still turning over the letters. "Never mind," said Terence shortly. "I will make inquiries for myself." Rodriguez put the letters back in his pocket. "Very well," he remarked. "I have no objection." He lifted his eyebrows, shrugged his shoulders, as if to repeat that they took the illness much too seriously, and that there was no other doctor, and slipped out, leaving behind him an impression that he was conscious that he was distrusted, and that his malice was aroused. After this, Terence could no longer stay downstairs. He went up, knocked at Rachel's door, and asked Helen whether he might see her for a few minutes. He had not seen her yesterday. She made no objection, and went and sat at a table in the window. Terence sat down by the bedside. Rachel's face was changed. She looked as though she were entirely concentrated upon the effort of keeping alive. Her lips were drawn, and her cheeks were sunken and flushed, though without colour. Her eyes were not entirely shut, the lower half of the white part showing, not as if she saw, but as if they remained open because she was much too exhausted to close them. She opened them completely when he kissed her, but she only saw an old woman slicing a man's head off with a knife. "There it falls," she murmured. Then she turned to Terence and asked him anxiously some question about a man with mules, which he could not understand. "Why doesn't he come? Why doesn't he come?" she repeated. He was appalled to think of the dirty little man downstairs in connection with illness like this, and turning instinctively to Helen, but she was doing something at the table in the window and did not seem to realise how great the shock to him must be. He rose to go, for he could not endure to listen any longer. His heart beat quickly and painfully with anger and misery. As he passed Helen, she asked him in the same weary, unnatural, but determined voice to fetch her more ice, and to have the jug outside filled with fresh milk. When he had done these errands, he went to find Hurst. Exhausted and very hot, St. John had fallen asleep on a bed, but Terence woke him without scruple. "Helen thinks she's worse," he said. "There's no doubt she's frightfully ill. Rodriguez is useless. We must get another doctor." "But there is no other doctor," said Hurst drowsily, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Don't be a damned fool!" Terence exclaimed. "Of course there's another doctor. And if there isn't, you've got to find one. It ought to have been done days ago. I'm going down to saddle the horse." He could not stay still in one place. In less than 10 minutes St. John was riding to the town in the scorching heat in search of a doctor, his orders being to find one and bring him back if he had to be fetched in a special train. "We ought to have done it days ago," Hewitt repeated angrily. When he went back into the drawing room he found that Mrs. Flushing was there, standing very erect in the middle of the room, having arrived, as people did in these days, by the kitchen or through the garden unannounced. "She's better?" Mrs. Flushing inquired abruptly. They did not attempt to shake hands. "No," said Terence. "If anything, they think she's worse." Mrs. Flushing seemed to consider for a moment or two, looking straight at Terence all the time. "Let me tell you," she said, speaking in nervous jerks. "It's always about the 7th day one begins to get anxious. I dare say you've been sitting here worrying by yourself. You think she's bad, but anyone coming with a fresh eye would see she was better. Mr. Elliott's had fever. He's all right now," she threw out. "It wasn't anything she caught on the expedition. What's it matter, a few days' fever? My brother had fever for 26 days once, and in a week or two he was up and about. We gave him nothing but milk and arrowroot." Here Mrs. Chailey came in with a message. "I'm wanted upstairs," said Terence. "You see, she'll be better," Mrs. Flushing jerked out as he left the room. Her anxiety to persuade Terence was very great, and when he left her without saying anything, she felt dissatisfied and restless. She did not like to stay, but she could not bear to go. She wandered from room to room, looking for someone to talk to, but all the rooms were empty. Terence went upstairs, stood inside the door to take Helen's directions, looked over at Rachel, but did not attempt to speak to her. She appeared vaguely conscious of his presence, but it seemed to disturb her, and she turned, so that she lay with her back to him. For 6 days, indeed, she had been oblivious to the world outside, because it needed all her attention to follow the hot, red, quick sights which passed incessantly before her eyes. She knew that it was of enormous importance that she should attend to these sights and grasp their meaning, but she was always being just too late to hear or see something which would explain it all. For this reason the faces, Helen's face, the nurses', Terence's, the doctor's, which occasionally forced themselves very close to her, were worrying because they distracted her attention and she might miss the clue. However, on the 4th afternoon she was suddenly unable to keep Helen's face distinct from the sights themselves. Her lips widened as she bent down over the bed, and she began to gabble unintelligibly like the rest. The sights were all concerned in some plot, some adventure, some escape. The nature of what they were doing changed incessantly, although there was always a reason behind it, which she must endeavour to grasp. Now they were among trees and savages, now they were on the sea, now they were on the tops of high towers, now they jumped, now they flew. But just as the crisis was about to happen, something invariably slipped in her brain, so that the whole effort had to begin over again. The heat was suffocating. At last the faces went further away. She fell into a deep pool of sticky water, which eventually closed over her head. She saw nothing and heard nothing but a faint booming sound, which was the sound of the sea rolling over her head, while all her tormentors thought that she was dead. She was not dead, but curled up at the bottom of the sea. There she lay, sometimes seeing darkness, sometimes light, while every now and then someone turned her over at the bottom of the sea. After St. John had spent some hours in the heat of the sun wrangling with evasive and very garrulous natives, he extracted the information that there was a doctor, a French doctor, who was at present away on a holiday in the hills. It was quite impossible, so they said, to find him. With his experience of the country, St. John thought it unlikely that a telegram would either be sent or received, but having reduced the distance of the hill town in which he was staying from 100 miles to 30 miles, and having hired a carriage and horses, he started at once to fetch the doctor himself. He succeeded in finding him, and eventually forced the unwilling man to leave his young wife and return forthwith. They reached the villa at midday on Tuesday. Terence came out to receive them, and St. John was struck by the fact that he had grown perceptibly thinner in the interval. He was white too. His eyes looked strange. But the curt speech and sulky, masterful manner of Dr. Lesage impressed them both favourably, although at the same time it was obvious that he was very much annoyed at the whole affair. Coming downstairs he gave his directions emphatically, but it never occurred to him to give an opinion, either because of the presence of Rodriguez, who was now obsequious as well as malicious, or because he took it for granted that they knew already what was to be known. "Of course," he said with a shrug of his shoulders when Terence asked him, "Is she very ill?" They were both conscious of a certain sense of relief when Dr. Lesage was gone, leaving explicit directions and promising another visit in a few hours' time. But unfortunately the rise of their spirits led them to talk more than usual, and in talking they quarrelled. They quarrelled about a road, the Portsmouth road. St. John said that it is macadamised where it passes Hindhead, and Terence knew as well as he knew his own name that it is not macadamised at that point. In the course of the argument they said some very sharp things to each other, and the rest of the dinner was eaten in silence, save for an occasional half-stifled reflection from Ridley. When it grew dark and the lamps were brought in, Terence felt unable to control his irritation any longer. St. John went to bed in a state of complete exhaustion, bidding Terence good night with rather more affection than usual because of their quarrel, and Ridley retired to his books. Left alone, Terence walked up and down the room. He stood at the open window. The lights were coming out one after another in the town beneath, and it was very peaceful and cool in the garden, so that he stepped out onto the terrace. As he stood there in the darkness, able only to see the shapes of trees through the fine grey light, he was overcome by a desire to escape, to have done with this suffering, to forget that Rachel was ill. He allowed himself to lapse into forgetfulness of everything, as if a wind had been raging incessantly suddenly fell asleep. The fret and strain and anxiety which had been pressing on him passed away. He seemed to stand in an unvexed space of air, on a little island by himself. He was free and immune from pain. It did not matter whether Rachel was well or ill. It did not matter whether they were apart or together. Nothing mattered. Nothing mattered. The waves beat on the shore far away, and the soft wind passed through the branches of the tree, seeming to encircle him with peace and security, with dark and nothingness. Surely the world of strife and fret and anxiety was not the real world, but this was the real world, the world that lay beneath the superficial world, so that, whatever happened, one was secure. The quiet and peace seemed to lap his body in a fine, cool sheet, soothing every nerve. His mind seemed once more to expand and become natural. But when he had stood thus for a time, a noise in the house roused him. He turned instinctively and went into the drawing-room. The sight of the lamp-lit room brought back so abruptly all that he had forgotten, that he stood for a moment unable to move. He remembered everything, the hour, the minute even, what point they had reached, and what was to come. He cursed himself for making believe for a minute that things were different from what they are. The night was now harder to face than ever. Unable to stay in the empty drawing-room, he wandered out and sat on the stairs half-way up to Rachel's room. He longed for someone to talk to, but Hurst was asleep, and Ridley was asleep. There was no sound in Rachel's room. The only sound in the house was the sound of Chailey moving in the kitchen. At last there was a rustling on the stairs overhead, and Nurse McInnes came down fastening the links in her cuffs, in preparation for the night's watch. Terence rose and stopped her. He had scarcely spoken to her, but it was possible that she might confirm him in the belief which still persisted in his own mind, that Rachel was not seriously ill. He told her in a whisper that Dr. Lesage had been, and what he had said. "Now, nurse," he whispered, "please tell me your opinion. Do you consider that she is very seriously ill? Is she in any danger?" "The doctor has said—" she began. "Yes, but I want your opinion. You have had experience of many cases like this." "I could not tell you more than Dr. Lesage, Mr. Hewett," she replied cautiously, as though her words might be used against her. "The case is serious, but you may feel quite certain that we are doing all we can for Miss Vinrace." She spoke with some professional self-approbation, but she realized perhaps that she did not satisfy the young man, who still blocked her way, for she shifted her feet slightly upon the stair and looked out of the window where they could see the moon over the sea. "If you ask me," she began in a curiously stealthy tone, "I never like May for my patients." "May?" Terence repeated. "It may be a fancy, but I don't like to see anybody fall ill in May," she continued. "Things seem to go wrong in May." "Perhaps it's the moon. They say the moon affects the brain, don't they, sir?" He looked at her, but he could not answer her. Like all the others, when one looked at her, she seemed to shrivel beneath one's eyes and become worthless, malicious, and untrustworthy. She slipped past him and disappeared. Though he went to his room, he was unable even to take his clothes off. For a long time he paced up and down, and then, leaning out of the window, gazed at the earth which lay so dark against the paler blue of the sky. With a mixture of fear and loathing, he looked at the slim black cypress trees which were still visible in the garden, and heard the unfamiliar creaking and grating sounds which show that the earth is still hot. All these sights and sounds appeared sinister and full of hostility and foreboding. Together with the natives and the nurse and the doctor and the terrible force of the illness itself, they seemed to be in a conspiracy against him. They seemed to join together in their effort to extract the greatest possible amount of suffering from him. He could not get used to his pain. It was a revelation to him. He had never realized before that underneath every action, underneath the life of every day, pain lies, quiescent, but ready to devour. He seemed to be able to see suffering, as if it were a fire, curling up over the edges of all action, eating away the lives of men and women. He thought for the first time with understanding of words which had before seemed to him empty. The struggle of life, the hardness of life. Now he knew for himself that life is hard and full of suffering. He looked at the scattered lights in the town beneath, and thought of Arthur and Susan, or Evelyn and Perrott venturing out unwittingly, and by their happiness laying themselves open to suffering, such as this. How did they dare to love each other, he wondered? How had he himself dared to live as he had lived, rapidly and carelessly, passing from one thing to another, loving Rachel as he had loved her? Never again would he feel secure. He would never believe in the stability of life, or forget what depths of pain, lie beneath small happiness and feelings of content and safety. It seemed to him as he looked back that their happiness had never been so great as his pain was now. There had always been something imperfect in their happiness, something they had wanted and had not been able to get. It had been fragmentary and incomplete because they were so young and had not known what they were doing. The light of his candle flickered over the boughs of a tree outside the window, and as the branch swayed in the darkness there came before his mind a picture of all the world that lay outside his window. He thought of the immense river and the immense forest, the vast stretches of dry earth and the plains of the sea that encircled the earth. From the sea the sky rose steep and enormous, and the air washed profoundly between the sky and the sea. How vast and dark it must be to-night, lying exposed to the wind. And in all this great space it was curious to think how few the towns were, and how small little rings of light, or single glow-worms, he figured them, scattered here and there, among the swelling uncultivated folds of the world. And in those towns were little men and women, tiny men and women. Oh, it was absurd, when one thought of it, to sit here in a little room suffering and caring. What did anything matter? Rachel, a tiny creature, lay ill beneath him, and here in his little room he suffered on her account. The nearness of their bodies in this vast universe, and the minuteness of their bodies, seemed to him absurd and laughable. Nothing mattered, he repeated. They had no power, no hope. He leant on the window-sill, thinking, until he almost forgot the time and the place. Nevertheless, although he was convinced that it was absurd and laughable, and that they were small and hopeless, he never lost the sense that these thoughts somehow formed part of a life which he and Rachel would live together. Owing perhaps to the change of doctor, Rachel appeared to be rather better next day. Terribly pale and worn though Helen looked, there was a slight lifting of the cloud which had hung all these days in her eyes. "She talked to me," she said voluntarily. "She asked me what day of the week it was, like herself." Then suddenly, without any warning or any apparent reason, the tears formed in her eyes and rolled steadily down her cheeks. She cried with scarcely any attempt at movement of her features, and without any attempt to stop herself, as if she did not know that she was crying. In spite of the relief which her words gave him, Terence was dismayed by the sight. Had everything given way? Were there no limits to the power of this illness? Would everything go down before it? Helen had always seemed to him strong and determined, and now she was like a child. He took her in his arms, and she clung to him like a child, crying softly and quietly upon his shoulder. Then she roused herself and wiped her tears away. It was silly to behave like that, she said. Very silly, she repeated, when there could be no doubt that Rachel was better. She asked Terence to forgive her for her folly. She stopped at the door and came back and kissed him without saying anything. On this day, indeed, Rachel was conscious of what went on round her. She had come to the surface of the dark, sticky pool, and a wave seemed to bear her up and down with it. She had ceased to have any will of her own. She lay on the top of the wave, conscious of some pain, but chiefly of weakness. The wave was replaced by the side of a mountain. Her body became a drift of melting snow, above which her knees rose in huge peaked mountains of bare bone. It was true that she saw Helen and saw her room, but everything had become very pale and semi-transparent. Sometimes she could see through the wall in front of her. Sometimes when Helen went away she seemed to go so far that Rachel's eyes could hardly follow her. The room also had an odd power of expanding, and though she pushed her voice out as far as possible, until sometimes it became a bird and flew away, she thought it doubtful whether it ever reached the person she was talking to. There were immense intervals or chasms, for things still had the power to appear visibly before her, between one moment and the next. It sometimes took an hour for Helen to raise her arm, pausing long between each jerky movement, and pour out medicine. Helen's form, stooping to raise her in bed, appeared of gigantic size, and came down upon her like the ceiling falling. But for long spaces of time she would merely lie conscious of her body floating on the top of the bed, and her mind driven to some remote corner of her body, or escaped and gone flitting round the room. All sights were something of an effort, but the sight of Terence was the greatest effort, because he forced her to join mind to body in the desire to remember something. She did not wish to remember. It troubled her when people tried to disturb her loneliness. She wished to be alone. She wished for nothing else in the world. Although she had cried, Terence observed Helen's greater hopefulness with something like triumph. In the argument between them she had made the first sign of admitting herself in the wrong. He waited for Dr. Lesage to come down that afternoon with considerable anxiety, but with the same certainty at the back of his mind that he would in time force them all to admit that they were in the wrong. As usual, Dr. Lesage was sulky in his manner and very short in his answers. To Terence's demand, "She seems to be better," he replied, looking at him in an odd way, "She has a chance of life." The door shut, and Terence walked across to the window. He leant his forehead against the pane. "Rachel," he repeated to himself, "she has a chance of life. Rachel." How could they say these things of Rachel? Had anyone yesterday seriously believed that Rachel was dying? They had been engaged for 4 weeks. A fortnight ago she had been perfectly well. What could 14 days have done to bring her from that state to this? To realise what they meant by saying that she had a chance of life was beyond him, knowing as he did that they were engaged. He turned, still enveloped in the same dreary mist, and walked towards the door. Suddenly he saw it all. He saw the room and the garden, and the trees moving in the air. They could go on without her. She could die. For the first time since she fell ill, he remembered exactly what she looked like, and the way in which they cared for each other. The immense happiness of feeling her close to him mingled with a more intense anxiety than he had felt yet. He could not let her die. He could not live without her. But after a momentary struggle, the curtain fell again, and he saw nothing, and felt nothing clearly. It was all going on still, in the same way as before. Save for a physical pain when his heart beat, and the fact that his fingers were icy cold, he did not realise that he was anxious about anything. Within his mind he seemed to feel nothing about Rachel, or about anyone or anything in the world. He went on giving orders, arranging with Mrs. Chailey, writing out lists, and every now and then he went upstairs and put something quietly on the table outside Rachel's door. That night Dr. Lesage seemed to be less sulky than usual. He stayed voluntarily for a few moments, and, addressing St. John and Terence equally, as if he did not remember which of them was engaged to the young lady, said, "I consider that her condition to-night is very grave." Neither of them went to bed, or suggested that the other should go to bed. They sat in the drawing-room playing piquet with the door open. St. John made up a bed upon the sofa, and when it was ready insisted that Terence should lie upon it. They began to quarrel as to who should lie on the sofa and who should lie upon a couple of chairs covered with rugs. St. John forced Terence at last to lie down upon the sofa. "Don't be a fool, Terence," he said. "You'll only get ill if you don't sleep." "Old fellow," he began, as Terence still refused, and stopped abruptly, fearing sentimentality. He feared that he was on the verge of tears. He began to say, what he had long been wanting to say, that he was sorry for Terence, that he cared for him, that he cared for Rachel. Did she know how much he cared for her? Had she said anything, asked perhaps? He was very anxious to say this, but he refrained, thinking that it was a selfish question after all, and what was the use of bothering Terence to talk about such things? He was already half asleep, but St. John could not sleep at once. If only, he thought to himself, as he lay in the darkness, something would happen. If only this strain would come to an end. He did not mind what happened, so long as the succession of these hard and dreary days was broken. He did not mind if she died. He felt himself disloyal in not minding it, but it seemed to him that he had no feelings left. All night long there was no call or movement, except the opening and shutting of the bedroom door once. By degrees the light returned into the untidy room. At 6 the servants began to move, at 7 they crept downstairs into the kitchen, and half an hour later the day began again. Nevertheless it was not the same as the days that had gone before, although it would have been hard to say in what the difference consisted. Perhaps it was that they seemed to be waiting for something. There were certainly fewer things to be done than usual. People drifted through the drawing-room. Mr. Flushing, Mr. and Mrs. Thornbury. They spoke very apologetically, in low tones, refusing to sit down, but remaining for a considerable time standing up, although the only thing they had to say was, "Is there anything we can do?" And there was nothing they could do. Feeling oddly detached from it all, Terence remembered how Helen had said that whenever anything happened to you, this was how people behaved. Was she right, or was she wrong? He was too little interested to frame an opinion of his own. He put things away in his mind, as if one of these days he would think about them, but not now. The mist of unreality had deepened and deepened until it had produced a feeling of numbness all over his body. Was it his body? Were those really his own hands? This morning also, for the first time, Ridley found it impossible to sit alone in his room. He was very uncomfortable downstairs, and, as he did not know what was going on, constantly in the way. But he would not leave the drawing-room. Too restless to read, and having nothing to do, he began to pace up and down, reciting poetry in an undertone. Occupied in various ways, now in undoing parcels, now in uncorking bottles, now in writing directions, the sound of Ridley's song and the beat of his pacing worked into the minds of Terence and St. John all the morning as a half-comprehended refrain. They wrestled up, they wrestled down, they wrestled sore and still. The fiend who blinds the eyes of men, that night he had his will. Like stags full spent among the bent, they dropped a while to rest. "Oh, it's intolerable!" Hurst exclaimed, and then checked himself, as if it were a breach of their agreement. Again and again Terence would creep half-way up the stairs in case he might be able to glean news of Rachel. But the only news now was of a very fragmentary kind. She had drunk something, she had slept a little, she seemed quieter. In the same way, Dr. Lesage confined himself to talking about details, save once when he volunteered the information that he had just been called in to ascertain, by severing a vein in the wrist, that an old lady of 85 was really dead. She had a horror of being buried alive. "It is a horror," he remarked, "that we generally find in the very old, and seldom in the young." They both expressed their interest in what he told them. It seemed to them very strange. Another strange thing about the day was that the luncheon was forgotten by all of them until it was late in the afternoon, and then Mrs. Chailey waited on them, and looked strange too, because she wore a stiff print dress, and her sleeves were rolled up above the elbows. She seemed as oblivious of her appearance, however, as if she had been called out of bed by a midnight alarm of fire, and she had forgotten too her reserve and her composure. She talked to them quite familiarly, as if she had nursed them and held them naked on her knee. She assured them over and over again that it was their duty to eat. The afternoon, thus being shortened, passed more quickly than they expected. Once Mrs. Flushing opened the door, but on seeing them shut it again quickly. Once Helen came down to fetch something, but she stopped as she left the room to look at a letter addressed to her. She stood for a moment turning it over, and the extraordinary and mournful beauty of her attitude struck Terence in the way things struck him now, as something to be put away in his mind and to be thought about afterwards. They scarcely spoke, the argument between them seeming to be suspended or forgotten. Now that the afternoon sun had left the front of the house, Ridley paced up and down the terrace repeating stanzas of a long poem. In a subdued but suddenly sonorous voice, fragments of the poem were wafted in at the open window as he passed and repassed. Peor and Baalim forsake their temples dim, with that twice battered god of Palestine, and mooned Astaroth. The sound of these words was strangely discomforting to both the young men, but they had to be borne. As the evening drew on, and the red light of the sunset glittered far away on the sea, the same sense of desperation attacked both Terence and St. John at the thought that the day was nearly over, and that another night was at hand. The appearance of one light after another in the town beneath them produced in Hurst a repetition of his terrible and disgusting desire to break down and sob. Then the lamps were brought in by Chailey. She explained that Maria, in opening a bottle, had been so foolish as to cut her arm badly, but she had bound it up. It was unfortunate when there was so much work to be done. Chailey herself limped, because of the rheumatism in her feet, but it appeared to her mere waste of time to take any notice of the unruly flesh of servants. The evening went on. Dr. Lesage arrived unexpectedly and stayed upstairs a very long time. He came down once and drank a cup of coffee. "She is very ill," he said in answer to Ridley's question. All the annoyance had by this time left his manner. He was grave and formal, but at the same time it was full of consideration, which had not marked it before. He went upstairs again. The three men sat together in the drawing-room. Ridley was quite quiet now, and his attention seemed to be thoroughly awakened. Save for little half-voluntary movements and exclamations that were stifled at once, they waited in complete silence. It seemed as if they were at last brought together face to face with something definite. It was nearly 11 o'clock when Dr. Lesage again appeared in the room. He approached them very slowly, and did not speak at once. He looked first at St. John and then at Terence, and said to Terence, "Mr. Hewett, I think you should go upstairs now." Terence rose immediately, leaving the others seated, with Dr. Lesage standing motionless between them. Chailey was in the passage outside, repeating over and over again, "It's wicked! It's wicked!" Terence paid her no attention. He heard what she was saying, but it conveyed no meaning to his mind. All the way upstairs he kept saying to himself, "This has not happened to me. It is not possible that this has happened to me." He looked curiously at his own hand on the banisters. The stairs were very steep, and it seemed to take him a long time to surmount them. Instead of feeling keenly, as he knew that he ought to feel, he felt nothing at all. When he opened the door he saw Helen sitting by the bedside. There were shaded lights on the table, and the room, though it seemed to be full of a great many things, was very tidy. There was a faint and not unpleasant smell of disinfectants. Helen rose and gave up her chair to him in silence. As they passed each other their eyes met in a peculiar level glance. He wondered at the extraordinary clearness of his eyes, and at the deep calm and sadness that dwelt in him. He sat down by the bedside, and a moment afterwards heard the door shut gently behind her. He was alone with Rachel, and a faint reflection of the sense of relief that they used to feel when they were left alone possessed him. He looked at her. He expected to find some terrible change in her, but there was none. She looked indeed very thin, and, as far as he could see, very tired, but she was the same as she had always been. Moreover, she saw him and knew him. She smiled at him and said, "Hello, Terence." The curtain which had been drawn between them for so long vanished immediately. "Well, Rachel," he replied in his usual voice, upon which she opened her eyes quite widely and smiled with her familiar smile. He kissed her and took her hand. "It's been wretched without you," he said. She still looked at him and smiled, but soon a slight look of fatigue or perplexity came into her eyes and she shut them again. "But when we're together, we're perfectly happy," he said. He continued to hold her hand. The light being dim, it was impossible to see any change in her face. An immense feeling of peace came over Terence, so that he had no wish to move or to speak. The terrible torture and unreality of the last days were over, and he had come out now into perfect certainty and peace. His mind began to work naturally again and with great ease. The longer he sat there, the more profoundly was he conscious of the peace invading every corner of his soul. Once he held his breath and listened acutely. She was still breathing. He went on thinking for some time. They seemed to be thinking together. He seemed to be Rachel as well as himself. And then he listened again. No, she had ceased to breathe. So much the better. This was death. It was nothing. It was to cease to breathe. It was happiness. It was perfect happiness. They had now what they had always wanted to have, the union which had been impossible while they lived. Unconscious whether he thought the words or spoke them aloud, he said, "No two people have ever been so happy as we have been. No one has ever loved as we have loved." It seemed to him that their complete union and happiness filled the room with rings eddying more and more widely. He had no wish in the world left unfulfilled. They possessed what could never be taken from them. He was not conscious that anyone had come into the room, but later, moments later, or hours later perhaps, he felt an arm behind him. The arms were round him. He did not want to have arms round him, and the mysterious whispering voices annoyed him. He laid Rachel's hand, which was now cold, upon the counterpane, and rose from his chair and walked across to the window. The windows were uncurtained, and showed the moon and a long silver pathway upon the surface of the waves. "Why," he said, in his ordinary tone of voice, "look at the moon. There's a halo round the moon. We shall have rain tomorrow." The arms, whether they were the arms of man or of woman, were round him again. They were pushing him gently towards the door. He turned of his own accord and walked steadily in advance of the arms, conscious of a little amusement at the strange way in which people behaved merely because someone was dead. He would go if they wished it, but nothing they could do would disturb his happiness. As he saw the passage outside the room, and the table with the cups and the plates, it suddenly came over him that here was a world in which he would never see Rachel again. "Rachel! Rachel!" he shrieked, trying to rush back to her, but they prevented him, and pushed him down the passage and into a bedroom far from her room. Downstairs they could hear the thud of his feet on the floor as he struggled to break free, and twice they heard him shout, "Rachel! Rachel!" End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Voyage Out by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. For 2 or 3 hours longer the moon poured its light through the empty air. Unbroken by clouds, it fell straightly, and lay almost like a chill white frost over the sea and the earth. During these hours the silence was not broken, and the only movement was caused by the movement of trees and branches which stirred slightly, and then the shadows that lay across the white spaces of the land moved too. In this profound silence one sound only was audible, the sound of a slight but continuous breathing which never ceased, although it never rose and never fell. It continued after the birds had begun to flutter from branch to branch, and could be heard behind the first thin notes of their voices. It continued all through the hours when the east whitened and grew red, and a faint blue tinged the sky, but when the sun rose it ceased, and gave place to other sounds. The first sounds that were heard were little inarticulate cries, the cries, it seemed, of children or of the very poor, of people who were very weak or in pain. But when the sun was above the horizon, the air, which had been thin and pale, grew every moment richer and warmer, and the sounds of life became bolder and more full of courage and authority. By degrees the smoke began to ascend in wavering breaths over the houses, and these slowly thickened until they were as round and straight as columns, and instead of striking upon pale white blinds, the sun shone upon dark windows, beyond which there was depth and space. The sun had been up for many hours, and the great dome of air was warmed through and glittering with thin gold threads of sunlight before any one moved in the hotel. White and massive it stood in the early light, half asleep with its blinds down. At about 9:30 Miss Allen came very slowly into the hall, and walked very slowly to the table where the morning papers were laid, but she did not put out her hand to take one. She stood still, thinking, with her head a little sunk upon her shoulders. She looked curiously old, and from the way in which she stood, a little hunched together and very massive, you could see what she would be like when she was really old, how she would sit day after day in her chair looking placidly in front of her. Other people began to come into the room and to pass her, but she did not speak to any of them, or even look at them, and at last, as if it were necessary to do something, she sat down in a chair and looked quietly and fixedly in front of her. She felt very old this morning, and useless too, as if her life had been a failure, as if it had been hard and laborious to no purpose. She did not want to go on living, and yet she knew that she would. She was so strong that she would live to be a very old woman. She would probably live to be 80, and as she was now 50, that left 30 years more for her to live. She turned her hands over and over in her lap and looked at them curiously. Her old hands that had done so much work for her. There did not seem to be much point in it all. One went on. Of course one went on. She looked up to see Mrs. Thornbury standing beside her, with lines drawn upon her forehead, and her lips parted as if she were about to ask a question. Miss Allen anticipated her. "Yes," she said. "She died this morning, very early, about 3 o'clock." Mrs. Thornbury made a little exclamation, drew her lips together, and the tears rose in her eyes. Through them she looked at the hall, which was now laid with great breadths of sunlight, and at the careless, casual groups of people who were standing beside the solid armchairs and tables. They looked to her unreal, or as people look who remain unconscious that some great explosion is about to take place beside them. But there was no explosion, and they went on standing by the chairs and the tables. Mrs. Thornbury no longer saw them, but, penetrating through them as though they were without substance, she saw the house, the people in the house, the room, the bed in the room, and the figure of the dead lying still in the dark beneath the sheets. She could almost see the dead. She could almost hear the voices of the mourners. "They expected it?" she asked at length. Miss Allen could only shake her head. "I know nothing," she replied, "except what Mrs. Flushing's maid told me. She died early this morning." The two women looked at each other with a quiet significant gaze, and then, feeling oddly dazed, and seeking she did not know exactly what, Mrs. Thornbury went slowly upstairs and walked quietly along the passages, touching the wall with her fingers as if to guide herself. Housemaids were passing briskly from room to room, but Mrs. Thornbury avoided them. She hardly saw them. They seemed to her to be in another world. She did not even look up directly when Evelyn stopped her. It was evident that Evelyn had been lately in tears, and when she looked at Mrs. Thornbury she began to cry again. Together they drew into the hollow of a window, and stood there in silence. Broken words formed themselves at last among Evelyn's sobs. "It was wicked," she sobbed. "It was cruel. They were so happy." Mrs. Thornbury patted her on the shoulder. "It seems hard, very hard," she said. She paused and looked out over the slope of the hill at the Ambroses' villa. The windows were blazing in the sun, and she thought how the soul of the dead had passed from those windows. Something had passed from the world. It seemed to her strangely empty. "And yet the older one grows," she continued, her eyes regaining more than their usual brightness, "the more certain one becomes that there is a reason. How could one go on if there were no reason?" she asked. She asked the question of someone, but she did not ask it of Evelyn. Evelyn's sobs were becoming quieter. "There must be a reason," she said. "It can't only be an accident. For it was an accident, it need never have happened." Mrs. Thornbury sighed deeply. "But we must not let ourselves think of that," she added. "And let us hope that they don't either. Whatever they had done, it might have been the same. These terrible illnesses—" "There's no reason—I don't believe there's any reason at all," Evelyn broke out, pulling the blind down and letting it fly back with a little snap. "Why should these things happen? Why should people suffer? I honestly believe," she went on, lowering her voice slightly, "that Rachel's in heaven. But Terence—" "What's the good of it all?" she demanded. Mrs. Thornbury shook her head slightly, but made no reply, and pressing Evelyn's hand she went on down the passage. Impelled by a strong desire to hear something, although she did not know exactly what there was to hear, she was making her way to the Flushings' room. As she opened their door she felt that she had interrupted some argument between husband and wife. Mrs. Flushing was sitting with her back to the light, and Mr. Flushing was standing near her, arguing and trying to persuade her of something. "Ah, here is Mrs. Thornbury," he began with some relief in his voice. "You have heard, of course. My wife feels that she was in some way responsible. She urged poor Miss Vinrace to come on the expedition. I'm sure you will agree with me that it is most unreasonable to feel that. We don't even know—in fact, I think it most unlikely that she caught her illness there. These diseases— Besides, she was set on going. She would have gone whether you asked her or not, Alice." "Don't, Wilfrid," said Mrs. Flushing, neither moving nor taking her eyes off the spot on the floor upon which they rested. "What's the use of talking? What's the use?" She ceased. "I was coming to ask you," said Mrs. Thornbury, addressing Wilfrid, for it was useless to speak to his wife, "is there anything you think that one could do? Has the father arrived? Could one go and see?" The strongest wish in her being at this moment was to be able to do something for the unhappy people, to see them, to assure them, to help them. It was dreadful to be so far away from them, but Mr. Flushing shook his head. He did not think that now—later perhaps one might be able to help. Here Mrs. Flushing rose stiffly, turned her back to them, and walked to the dressing room opposite. As she walked, they could see her breast slowly rise and slowly fall. But her grief was silent. She shut the door behind her. When she was alone by herself she clenched her fists together, and began beating the back of a chair with them. She was like a wounded animal. She hated death. She was furious, outraged, indignant with death, as if it were a living creature. She refused to relinquish her friends to death. She would not submit to darkened nothingness. She began to pace up and down, clenching her hands and making no attempt to stop the quick tears which raced down her cheeks. She sat still at last, but she did not submit. She looked stubborn and strong when she had ceased to cry. In the next room, meanwhile, Wilfrid was talking to Mrs. Thornbury with greater freedom now that his wife was not sitting there. "That's the worst of these places," he said. "People will behave as though they were in England, and they're not. I've no doubt myself that Miss Vinrace caught the infection up at the villa itself. She probably ran risks a dozen times a day that might have given her the illness. It's absurd to say she caught it with us." If he had not been sincerely sorry for them, he would have been annoyed. "Pepper tells me," he continued, "that he left the house because he thought them so careless. He says they never washed their vegetables properly. Poor people! It's a fearful price to pay, but it's only what I've seen over and over again. People seem to forget that these things happen, and then they do happen, and they're surprised." Mrs. Thornbury agreed with him that they had been very careless, and that there was no reason whatever to think that she had caught the fever on the expedition, and after talking about other things for a short time, she left him and went sadly along the passage to her own room. There must be some reason why such things happen, she thought to herself as she shut the door. Only at first it was not easy to understand what it was. It seemed so strange, so unbelievable. Why, only 3 weeks ago, only a fortnight ago, she had seen Rachel. When she shut her eyes she could almost see her now, the quiet, shy girl who was going to be married. She thought of all that she would have missed had she died at Rachel's age, the children, the married life, the unimaginable depths and miracles that seemed to her, as she looked back, to have lain about her day after day and year after year. The stunned feeling, which had been making it difficult for her to think, gradually gave way to a feeling of the opposite nature. She thought very quickly and very clearly, and looking back over all her experiences tried to fit them into a kind of order. There was undoubtedly much suffering, much struggling, but on the whole, surely there was a balance of happiness. Surely order did prevail. Nor were the deaths of young people really the saddest things in life. They were saved so much. They kept so much. The dead, she called to mind those who had died early, accidentally, were beautiful. She often dreamt of the dead, and in time Terence himself would come to feel... She got up and began to wander restlessly about the room. For an old woman of her age she was very restless, and for one of her clear, quick mind she was unusually perplexed. She could not settle to anything, so that she was relieved when the door opened. She went up to her husband, took him in her arms and kissed him with unusual intensity, and then as they sat down together she began to pat him and question him as if he were a baby, an old, tired, querulous baby. She did not tell him about Miss Vinrace's death, for that would only disturb him, and he was put out already. She tried to discover why he was uneasy. Politics again? What were those horrid people doing? She spent the whole morning in discussing politics with her husband, and by degrees she became deeply interested in what they were saying. But every now and then what she was saying seemed to her oddly empty of meaning. At luncheon it was remarked by several people that the visitors at the hotel were beginning to leave. There were fewer every day. There were only 40 people at luncheon, instead of the 60 that there had been. So old Mrs. Paley computed, gazing about her with her faded eyes as she took her seat at her own table in the window. Her party generally consisted of Mr. Perrott, as well as Arthur and Susan, and today Evelyn was lunching with them also. She was unusually subdued. Having noticed that her eyes were red and guessing the reason, the others took pains to keep up an elaborate conversation between themselves. She suffered it to go on for a few minutes, leaning both elbows on the table and leaving her soup untouched, when she exclaimed suddenly, "I don't know how you feel, but I can simply think of nothing else." The gentleman murmured sympathetically and looked grave. Susan replied, "Yes, isn't it perfectly awful? When you think what a nice girl she was, only just engaged, and this need never have happened, it seems too tragic." She looked at Arthur as though he might be able to help her with something more suitable. "Hard lines," said Arthur briefly, "but it was a foolish thing to do, to go up that river." He shook his head. "They should have known better. You can't expect English women to stand roughing it as the natives do, who've been acclimatised. I'd half a mind to warn them at tea that day when it was being discussed. But it's no good saying these sort of things. It only puts people's backs up. It never makes any difference." Old Mrs. Paley, hitherto contented with her soup, here intimated, by raising one hand to her ear, that she wished to know what was being said. "You heard, Aunt Emma, that poor Miss Vinrace has died of the fever," Susan informed her gently. She could not speak of death loudly or even in her usual voice, so that Mrs. Paley did not catch a word. Arthur came to the rescue. "Miss Vinrace is dead," he said very distinctly. Mrs. Paley merely bent a little towards him and asked, "Eh?" "Miss Vinrace is dead," he repeated, It was only by stiffening all the muscles round his mouth that he could prevent himself from bursting into laughter, and forced himself to repeat for the third time, "Miss Vinrace, she's dead." Let alone the difficulty of hearing the exact words, facts that were outside her daily experience took some time to reach Mrs. Paley's consciousness. A weight seemed to rest upon her brain, impeding, though not damaging, its action. She sat vague-eyed for at least a minute before she realised what Arthur meant. "Dead?" she said vaguely. "Miss Vinrace dead? Dear me, that's very sad. But I don't at the moment remember which she was. We seem to have made so many new acquaintances here." She looked at Susan for help. "A tall, dark girl who just missed being handsome with a high colour?" "No," Susan interposed. "She was—" Then she gave it up in despair. There was no use in explaining that Mrs. Paley was thinking of the wrong person. "She ought not to have died," Mrs. Paley continued. "She looked so strong. But people will drink the water. I can never make out why. It seems such a simple thing to tell them to put a bottle of seltzer water in your bedroom. That's all the precaution I've ever taken, and I've been in every part of the world, I may say, Italy a dozen times over. But young people always think they know better, and then they pay the penalty. Poor thing, I am very sorry for her." But the difficulty of peering into a dish of potatoes and helping herself engrossed her attention. Arthur and Susan both secretly hoped that the subject was now disposed of, for there seemed to them something unpleasant in the discussion. But Evelyn was not ready to let it drop. Why would people never talk about the things that mattered? "I don't believe you care a bit," she said, turning savagely upon Mr. Perrott, who had sat all this time in silence. "I? Oh, yes, I do," he answered awkwardly, but with obvious sincerity. Evelyn's questions made him too feel uncomfortable. "It seems so inexplicable," Evelyn continued. "Death, I mean. Why should she be dead, and not you or I? It was only a fortnight ago that she was here with the rest of us. What do you believe?" she demanded of Mr. Perrott. "Do you believe that things go on, that she's still somewhere, or do you think it's simply a game, we crumble up to nothing when we die? I'm positive Rachel's not dead." Mr. Perrott would have said almost anything that Evelyn wanted him to say, but to assert that he believed in the immortality of the soul was not in his power. He sat silent, more deeply wrinkled than usual, crumbling his bread. Lest Evelyn should next ask him what he believed, Arthur, after making a pause equivalent to a full stop, started a completely different topic. "Supposing," he said, "a man were to write and tell you that he wanted £5 because he had known your grandfather, what would you do? It was this way. My grandfather—" "Invented a stove," said Evelyn. "I know all about that. We had one in the conservatory to keep the plants warm." "Didn't know I was so famous," said Arthur. "Well," he continued, determined at all cost to spin his story out at length, "the old chap, being about the second best inventor of his day, and a capable lawyer too, died, as they always do, without making a will. Now Fielding, his clerk, with how much justice I don't know, always claimed that he meant to do something for him. The poor old boy's come down in the world, through trying inventions on his own account, lives in Penge over a tobacconist's shop. I've been to see him there. The question is, must I stump up or not? What does the abstract spirit of justice require, Perrott? Remember, I didn't benefit under my grandfather's will, and I've no way of testing the truth of the story." "I don't know much about the abstract spirit of justice," said Susan, smiling complacently at the others, "but I'm certain of one thing, he'll get his £5." As Mr. Perrott proceeded to deliver an opinion, and Evelyn insisted that he was much too stingy, like all lawyers, thinking of the letter and not of the spirit, while Mrs. Paley required to be kept informed between the courses as to what they were all saying, the luncheon passed with no interval of silence, and Arthur congratulated himself upon the tact with which the discussion had been smoothed over. As they left the room it happened that Mrs. Paley's wheeled chair ran into the Elliots', who were coming through the door as she was going out. Brought thus to a standstill for a moment, Arthur and Susan congratulated Hughley Elliot upon his convalescence. He was down, cadaverous enough, for the first time, and Mr. Perrott took occasion to say a few words in private to Evelyn. "Would there be any chance of seeing you this afternoon, about 3:30, say? I shall be in the garden by the fountain." The block dissolved before Evelyn answered, but as she left them in the hall, she looked at him brightly and said, "3:30, did you say? That'll suit me." She ran upstairs with the feeling of spiritual exaltation and quickened life which the prospect of an emotional scene always aroused in her. That Mr. Perrott was again about to propose to her she had no doubt, and she was aware that on this occasion she ought to be prepared with a definite answer, for she was going away in 3 days' time. But she could not bring her mind to bear upon the question. To come to a decision was very difficult to her, because she had a natural dislike of anything final and done with. She liked to go on and on, always on and on. She was leaving, and therefore she occupied herself in laying her clothes out side by side upon the bed. She observed that some were very shabby. She took the photograph of her father and mother, and before she laid it away in her box, she held it for a minute in her hand. Rachel had looked at it. Suddenly the keen feeling of someone's personality, which things that they have owned or handled sometimes preserves, overcame her. She felt Rachel in the room with her. It was as if she were on a ship at sea, and the life of the day was unreal as the land in the distance. But by degrees the feeling of Rachel's presence passed away, and she could no longer realise her, for she had scarcely known her. But this momentary sensation left her depressed and fatigued. What had she done with her life? What future was there before her? What was make-believe and what was real? Were these proposals and intimacies and adventures real, or was the contentment which she had seen on the faces of Susan and Rachel more real than anything she had ever felt? She made herself ready to go downstairs, absent-mindedly, but her fingers were so well trained that they did the work of preparing her almost of their own accord. When she was actually on the way downstairs, the blood began to circle through her body of its own accord too, for her mind felt very dull. Mr. Perrott was waiting for her. Indeed, he had gone straight into the garden after luncheon, and had been walking up and down the path for more than half an hour in a state of acute suspense. "I'm late as usual," she exclaimed as she caught sight of him. "Well, you must forgive me. I had to pack up. My word, it looks stormy. And that's a new steamer in the bay, isn't it?" She looked at the bay, in which a steamer was just dropping anchor, the smoke still hanging about it, while a swift black shudder ran through the waves. "One's quite forgotten what rain looks like," she added. But Mr. Perrott paid no attention to the steamer or to the weather. "Miss Murgatroyd," he began with his usual formality, "I asked you to come here from a very selfish motive, I fear. I do not think you need to be assured once more of my feelings, but, as you are leaving so soon, I felt that I could not let you go without asking you to tell me, have I any reason to hope that you will ever come to care for me?" He was very pale and seemed unable to say more. The little gush of vitality which had come into Evelyn as she ran downstairs had left her, and she felt herself impotent. There was nothing for her to say. She felt nothing. Now that he was actually asking her, in his elderly, gentle words, to marry him, she felt less for him than she had ever felt before. "Let's sit down and talk it over," she said rather unsteadily. Mr. Perrott followed her to a curved green seat under a tree. They looked at the fountain in front of them, which had long ceased to play. Evelyn kept looking at the fountain instead of thinking of what she was saying. The fountain without any water seemed to be the type of her own being. "Of course I care for you," she began, rushing her words out in a hurry. "I should be a brute if I didn't. I think you're quite one of the nicest people I've ever known, and one of the finest too. But I wish you didn't care for me in that way. Are you sure you do?" For the moment she honestly desired that he should say no. "Quite sure," said Mr. Perrott. "You see, I'm not as simple as most women," Evelyn continued. "I think I want more. I don't know exactly what I feel." He sat by her, watching her and refraining from speech. "I sometimes think I haven't got it in me to care very much for one person only. Someone else would make you a better wife. I can imagine you very happy with someone else." "If you think that there is any chance that you will come to care for me, I am quite content to wait," said Mr. Perrott. "Well, there's no hurry, is there?" said Evelyn. "Suppose I thought it over and wrote and told you when I get back. I'm going to Moscow. I'll write from Moscow." But Mr. Perrott persisted. "You cannot give me any kind of idea? I do not ask for a date. That would be most unreasonable." He paused, looking down at the gravel path. As she did not immediately answer, he went on: "I know very well that I have not much to offer you, either in myself or in my circumstances. And I forget, it cannot seem the miracle to you that it does to me. Until I met you, I had gone on in my own quiet way. We are both very quiet people, my sister and I, quite content with my lot. My friendship with Arthur was the most important thing in my life. Now that I know you, all that has changed. You seem to put such a spirit into everything. Life seems to hold so many possibilities that I had never dreamt of." "That's splendid!" Evelyn exclaimed, grasping his hand. "Now you'll go back and start all kinds of things, and make a great name in the world, and we'll go on being friends, whatever happens. We'll be great friends, won't we?" "Evelyn!" he moaned suddenly, and took her in his arms and kissed her. She did not resent it, although it made little impression on her. As she sat upright again, she said: "I never see why one shouldn't go on being friends, although some people do. And friendships do make a difference, don't they? They are the kind of things that matter in one's life." He looked at her with a bewildered expression, as if he did not really understand what she was saying. With a considerable effort he collected himself, stood up and said: "Now I think I have told you what I feel, and I will only add that I can wait as long as ever you wish." Left alone, Evelyn walked up and down the path. What did matter, then? What was the meaning of it all? End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Voyage Out by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. All that evening the clouds gathered, until they closed entirely over the blue of the sky. They seemed to narrow the space between earth and heaven, so that there was no room for the air to move in freely. And the waves, too, lay flat and yet rigid, as if they were restrained. The leaves on the bushes and trees in the garden hung closely together, and the feeling of pressure and restraint was increased by the short chirping sounds which came from the birds and insects. So strange were the lights and the silence that the busy hum of voices which usually filled the dining room at meal times had distinct gaps in it, and during these silences the clatter of the knives upon plates became audible. The first roll of thunder and the first heavy drop striking the pane caused a little stir. "It's coming," was said simultaneously in many different languages. There was then a profound silence, as if the thunder had withdrawn into itself. People had just begun to eat again when a gust of cold air came through the open windows, lifting tablecloths and skirts. A light flashed, and was instantly followed by a clap of thunder right over the hotel. The rain swished with it, and immediately there were all those sounds of windows being shut and doors slamming violently, which accompany a storm. The room grew suddenly several degrees darker, for the wind seemed to be driving waves of darkness across the earth. No one attempted to eat for a time, but sat looking out at the garden, with their forks in the air. The flashes now came frequently, lighting up faces as if they were going to be photographed, surprising them in tense and unnatural expressions. The clap followed close and violently upon them. Several women half rose from their chairs and then sat down again. But dinner was continued uneasily, with eyes upon the garden. The bushes outside were ruffled and whitened, and the wind pressed upon them, so that they seemed to stoop to the ground. The waiters had to press dishes upon the diners' notice, and the diners had to draw the attention of waiters, for they were all absorbed in looking at the storm. As the thunder showed no signs of withdrawing, but seemed massed right overhead, while the lightning aimed straight at the garden every time, an uneasy gloom replaced the first excitement. Finishing the meal very quickly, people congregated in the hall, where they felt more secure than in any other place, because they could retreat far from the windows, and although they heard the thunder, they could not see anything. A little boy was carried away sobbing in the arms of his mother. While the storm continued, no one seemed inclined to sit down, but they collected in little groups under the central skylight, where they stood in a yellow atmosphere, looking upwards. Now and again their faces became white as the lightning flashed, and finally a terrific crash came, making the panes of the skylight lift at the joints. "Ah!" several voices exclaimed at the same moment. "Something struck," said a man's voice. The rain rushed down. The rain seemed now to extinguish the lightning and the thunder, and the hall became almost dark. After a minute or two, when nothing was heard but the rattle of water upon the glass, there was a perceptible slackening of the sound, and then the atmosphere became lighter. "It's over," said another voice. At a touch, all the electric lights were turned on, and revealed a crowd of people all standing, all looking with rather strained faces up at the skylight, but when they saw each other in the artificial light, they turned at once and began to move away. For some minutes the rain continued to rattle upon the skylight, and the thunder gave another shake or two, but it was evident from the clearing of the darkness, and the light drumming of the rain upon the roof, that the great confused ocean of air was travelling away from them, and passing high overhead, with its clouds and its rods of fire, out to sea. The building, which had seemed so small in the tumult of the storm, now became as square and spacious as usual. As the storm drew away, the people in the hall of the hotel sat down, and with a comfortable sense of relief began to tell each other stories about great storms, and produced in many cases their occupations for the evening. The chessboard was brought out, and Mr. Elliot, who wore a stock instead of a collar as a sign of convalescence, but was otherwise much as usual, challenged Mr. Pepper to a final contest. Round them gathered a group of ladies with pieces of needlework, or in default of needlework, with novels to superintend the game, much as if they were in charge of two small boys playing marbles. Every now and then they looked at the board and made some encouraging remark to the gentlemen. Mrs. Paley, just round the corner, had her cards arranged in long ladders before her, with Susan sitting near to sympathise but not to correct, and the merchants and the miscellaneous people who had never been discovered to possess names, were stretched in their arm-chairs with their newspapers on their knees. The conversation in these circumstances was very gentle, fragmentary, and intermittent, but the room was full of the indescribable stir of life. Every now and then the moth, which was now grey of wing and shiny of thorax, whizzed over their heads, and hit the lamps with a thud. A young woman put down her needlework and exclaimed, "Poor creature! It would be kinder to kill it." But nobody seemed disposed to rouse himself in order to kill the moth. They watched it dash from lamp to lamp because they were comfortable and had nothing to do. On the sofa, beside the chess players, Mrs. Elliot was imparting a new stitch in knitting to Mrs. Thornbury, so that their heads came very near together, and were only to be distinguished by the old lace cap which Mrs. Thornbury wore in the evening. Mrs. Elliot was an expert at knitting, and disclaimed a compliment to that effect with evident pride. "I suppose we're all proud of something," she said, "and I'm proud of my knitting. I think things like that run in families. We all knit well. I had an uncle who knitted his own socks to the day of his death, and he did it better than any of his daughters, dear old gentleman. Now I wonder that you, Miss Allen, who use your eyes so much, don't take up knitting in the evenings. You'll find it such a relief, I should say, such a rest to the eyes, and the bazaars are so glad of things." Her voice dropped into the smooth half-conscious tone of the expert knitter. The words came gently one after another. "As much as I do I can always dispose of, which is a comfort, for then I feel that I am not wasting my time." Miss Allen, being thus addressed, shut her novel and observed the others placidly for a time. At last she said, "It is surely not natural to leave your wife because she happens to be in love with you, but that, as far as I can make out, is what the gentleman in my story does." "Tut, tut, that doesn't sound good. No, that doesn't sound at all natural," murmured the knitters in their absorbed voices. "Still, it's the kind of book people call very clever," Mrs. Allen added. "Maternity, by Michael Jessop, I presume," Mr. Elliot put in, for he could never resist the temptation of talking while he played chess. "Do you know," said Mrs. Elliot, after a moment, "I don't think people do write good novels now. Not as good as they used to, anyhow." No one took the trouble to agree with her or to disagree with her. Arthur Venning, who was strolling about, sometimes looking at the game, sometimes reading a page of a magazine, looked at Miss Allen, who was half asleep, and said humorously, "A penny for your thoughts, Miss Allen." The others looked up. They were glad that he had not spoken to them. But Miss Allen replied without any hesitation, "I was thinking of my imaginary uncle. Hasn't everyone got an imaginary uncle?" she continued. "I have one, a most delightful old gentleman. He's always giving me things. Sometimes it's a gold watch, sometimes it's a carriage and pair, sometimes it's a beautiful little cottage in the New Forest, sometimes it's a ticket to the place I most want to see." She set them all thinking vaguely of the things they wanted. Mrs. Elliot knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted a child, and the usual little pucker deepened on her brow. "We're such lucky people," she said, looking at her husband. "We really have no wants." She was apt to say this, partly in order to convince herself, and partly in order to convince other people. But she was prevented from wondering how far she carried conviction by the entrance of Mr. and Mrs. Flushing, who came through the hall and stopped by the chess-board. Mrs. Flushing looked wilder than ever. A great strand of black hair looped down across her brow. Her cheeks were whipped a dark blood red, and drops of rain made wet marks upon them. Mr. Flushing explained that they had been on the roof watching the storm. "It was a wonderful sight," he said. "The lightning went right out over the sea, and lit up the waves and the ships far away. You can't think how wonderful the mountains looked too, with the lights on them, and the great masses of shadow. It's all over now." He slid down into a chair, becoming interested in the final struggle of the game. "And you go back to-morrow?" said Mrs. Thornbury, looking at Mrs. Flushing. "Yes," she replied. "And indeed one is not sorry to go back," said Mrs. Elliot, assuming an air of mournful anxiety, "after all this illness." "Are you afraid of dying?" Mrs. Flushing demanded scornfully. "I think we are all afraid of that," said Mrs. Elliot with dignity. "I suppose we're all cowards when it comes to the point," said Mrs. Flushing, rubbing her cheek against the back of the chair. "I'm sure I am." "Not a bit of it," said Mr. Flushing, turning round, for Mr. Pepper took a very long time to consider his move. "It's not cowardly to wish to live, Alice. It's the very reverse of cowardly. Personally, I'd like to go on for 100 years. Granted, of course, that I had the full use of my faculties. Think of the things that are bound to happen." "That is what I feel," Mrs. Thornbury rejoined. "The changes, the improvements, the inventions, and beauty. Do you know I feel sometimes that I couldn't bear to die and cease to see beautiful things about me." "It would certainly be very dull to die before they have discovered whether there is life in Mars," Miss Allen added. "Do you really believe there's life in Mars?" asked Mrs. Flushing, turning to her for the first time with keen interest. "Who tells you that? Someone who knows? Do you know a man called—" Here Mrs. Thornbury laid down her knitting, and a look of extreme solicitude came into her eyes. "There is Mr. Hurst," she said quietly. St. John had just come through the swing door. He was rather blown about by the wind, and his cheeks looked terribly pale, unshorn, and cavernous. After taking off his coat he was going to pass straight through the hall and up to his room, but he could not ignore the presence of so many people he knew, especially as Mrs. Thornbury rose and went up to him, holding out her hand. But the shock of the warm lamp-lit room, together with the sight of so many cheerful human beings sitting together at their ease, after the dark walk in the rain, and the long days of strain and horror, overcame him completely. He looked at Mrs. Thornbury and could not speak. Everyone was silent. Mr. Pepper's hand stayed upon his knight. Mrs. Thornbury somehow moved him to a chair, sat herself beside him, and with tears in her own eyes said gently, "You have done everything for your friend." Her action set them all talking again as if they had never stopped, and Mr. Pepper finished the move with his knight. "There was nothing to be done," said St. John. He spoke very slowly. "It seems impossible." He drew his hand across his eyes as if some dream came between him and the others and prevented him from seeing where he was. "And that poor fellow," said Mrs. Thornbury, the tears falling again down her cheeks. "Impossible," St. John repeated. "Did he have the consolation of knowing—" Mrs. Thornbury began very tentatively. But St. John made no reply. He lay back in his chair, half seeing the others, half hearing what they said. He was terribly tired, and the light and warmth, the movements of the hands, and the soft communicative voices soothed him. They gave him a strange sense of quiet and relief. As he sat there motionless, this feeling of relief became a feeling of profound happiness. Without any sense of disloyalty to Terence and Rachel, he ceased to think about either of them. The movements and the voices seemed to draw together from different parts of the room, and to combine themselves into a pattern before his eyes. He was content to sit silently watching the pattern build itself up, looking at what he hardly saw. The game was really a good one, and Mr. Pepper and Mr. Elliot were becoming more and more set upon the struggle. Mrs. Thornbury, seeing that St. John did not wish to talk, resumed her knitting. "Lightning again!" Mrs. Flushing suddenly exclaimed. A yellow flash across the blue window, and for a second they saw the green trees outside. She strode to the door, pushed it open, and stood half out in the open air. But the light was only the reflection of the storm which was over. The rain had ceased, the heavy clouds were blown away, and the air was thin and clear, although vaporish mists were being driven swiftly across the moon. The sky was once more deep and solemn blue, and the shape of the earth was visible at the bottom of the air, enormous, dark, and solid, rising into the tapering mass of the mountain, and pricked here and there on the slopes by the tiny lights of villas. The driving air, the drone of the trees, and the flashing light which now and again spread a broad illumination over the earth, filled Mrs. Flushing with exultation. Her breasts rose and fell. "Splendid! Splendid!" she muttered to herself. Then she turned back into the hall and exclaimed in a peremptory voice, "Come outside and see, Wilfrid. It's wonderful." Some half stirred, some rose, some dropped their balls of wool and began to stoop to look for them. "To bed, to bed," said Miss Allen. "It was the move with your queen that gave it away, Pepper," exclaimed Mr. Elliot triumphantly, sweeping the pieces together and standing up. He had won the game. "What! Pepper beaten at last? I congratulate you," said Arthur Venning, who was wheeling old Mrs. Paley to bed. All these voices sounded gratefully in St. John's ears as he lay half asleep, and yet vividly conscious of everything around him. Across his eyes passed a procession of objects, black and indistinct, the figures of people picking up their books, their cards, their balls of wool, their work-baskets, and passing him one after another on their way to bed. End of chapter 27. End of The Voyage Out by Virginia Woolf.